For more than 4 decades, he moved through America's cities unnoticed, a quiet drifter with a photographic memory and a deadly obsession. 93 confessions, 93 lives erased. He remembered every face, even the color of their eyes. And yet for years, no one even knew his name. He wasn't the monster hiding in the dark. He was the man sitting next to you at a diner, sketching the faces of the women he killed. His memory became his museum, and every portrait told a story the world had forgotten. This is the haunting, true story of Samuel Little, the most prolific serial killer in American history, whose crimes forced the world to rethink what evil truly looks like. What drives a man to remember every victim and confess to every sin? You're about to step into the mind of a killer whose art revealed his truth, and whose truth exposed America's deepest blind spots. If you'd like more stories like this to appear on your page, please like, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe. There are 15 chapters in this series, each with one picture looping gently. Just close your eyes, relax, and let's dive into the story together. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. Shadows of a Troubled Childhood. Early life and formative years. Samuel Little's story begins not in infamy, but in the shadows of a turbulent and fractured childhood, a life marked by neglect, instability, and early brushes with violence. Born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, Little entered a world that offered him little protection and fewer chances for normalcy. His family life was far from the nurturing environment every child needs. His father was largely absent, leaving his mother to shoulder the burdens of raising him and his siblings under the weight of poverty and uncertainty. From the very beginning, Little faced circumstances that would shape his perceptions of the world, relationships, and, most tragically, human life. Even as a young boy, Little exhibited behaviors that hinted at the darkness which would later manifest in horrifying ways. He was reportedly violent toward other children and struggled to connect emotionally in ways that were considered typical. In school, he often acted out, not from a place of mischief, but from a deep, unresolved sense of anger and dislocation. Teachers and peers noticed his volatility, yet there were no substantial interventions, and the social structures that might have guided him toward empathy were missing. In many ways, his early experiences were a perfect storm for the emergence of a future serial killer. Chaos at home, a lack of positive role models, and early exposure to the harsh realities of a world that did not care for him. Little's adolescence was punctuated by a series of increasingly violent incidents. By his early teens, he was already involved in petty crimes and acts of aggression, often targeting those weaker than himself. This period of life reveals the first glimpses of a pattern that would become more pronounced in adulthood: a need to dominate, to control, and to harm others. Historians and criminologists who later studied his life point to this period as formative, noting that the seeds of his later atrocities were sown in these early years. Unlike other children who might have sought friendship or acceptance, Little's relationships were marked by manipulation, aggression, and a troubling lack of empathy. Growing up in the segregated South during the 1940s and 1950s, Little's environment was also saturated with societal violence and discrimination. Though his victims later came from a wide range of backgrounds, the systemic injustices and exposure to brutality in his formative years contributed to his understanding of power and survival. There was a constant lesson that the world was cruel, that authority could be both absent and oppressive, and that only the cunning, ruthless, and fearless would endure. This worldview, reinforced by poverty and instability, laid the psychological groundwork for a man capable of unspeakable crimes. Little's early experiences with the criminal justice system were sparse but telling. By his teenage years, he had already been arrested for minor offenses, Yet these encounters were sporadic and largely inconsequential in terms of long-term intervention. This lack of consistent consequences reinforced a sense of invincibility and an understanding that societal systems could be manipulated or avoided. Such experiences, combined with his personal traumas, gradually nurtured the emergence of a personality detached from the moral constraints that govern most human behavior. In addition to external pressures, Little wrestled with internal conflicts and compulsions that he could neither understand nor control. According to interviews conducted later in his life, he experienced a compulsion to harm women, an urge that he admitted surfaced long before his first confirmed murder. While psychological analysis cannot fully explain the horrors he would later commit, it is clear that these impulses were present early and festered in an environment devoid of structure, guidance, or intervention. His own recollections reveal a man aware of his differences, aware of the darkness within, yet powerless to channel it in any socially acceptable way. The formative years of Samuel Little also highlight the intersection between environment and inherent predisposition. While many children endure neglect, poverty, and exposure to violence without becoming killers, in Little's case, the combination of genetic, psychological, and environmental factors produced a lethal outcome. By the time he reached adulthood, he had already internalized the patterns of aggression, manipulation, and disregard for human life that would define his criminal career. Every skipped meal, every act of abandonment, every moment of social alienation contributed to the mosaic of a mind capable of rationalizing the most brutal acts of violence. As the 1950s drew to a close, Little began to leave his childhood behind, but not in any traditional sense. He carried the shadows of his early years with him, shadows that would stretch across decades and claim countless lives. His adolescence and early adulthood were not marked by education, career, or family, but by survival, crime, and the gradual honing of instincts that would later make him the most prolific serial killer in American history. Even in these early years, those who later studied his life could see patterns emerging. The mobility, the targeting of vulnerable women, and the combination of patience, cunning, and ruthlessness that would characterize his murders to Little's early life serves as a chilling reminder that the seeds of monstrosity often grow in ordinary, unseen circumstances. The combination of neglect, trauma, and early exposure to violence created a fertile ground for the emergence of a mind capable of staggering cruelty. It is a narrative that is at once horrifying and informative, providing insight into the environmental and psychological factors that can contribute to the making of a serial killer. Samuel Little's childhood was not just the story of a troubled boy. It was the opening chapter in a life that would leave an indelible mark on America, a prelude to decades of violence that would eventually claim 93 confirmed victims, with the reality that the true number may never be fully known. Understanding these early years is crucial, for it offers a window into the formation of patterns, the role of environment, and the origins of a darkness that would linger for over half a century before the world finally confronted it. As Samuel Little moved further into adolescence, the contours of his personality sharpened in ways that would eventually define his life of crime. By the late 1950s, he was already beginning to test the boundaries of the law, not with sophistication or strategy, but through impulsive acts of violence and petty criminality. These early encounters with crime, though minor compared to the atrocities to come, were pivotal in teaching him lessons about power, control, and consequence. The young Samuel began to understand that he could manipulate people, intimidate them, and escape repercussions, and these realizations festered over time, creating a dangerous sense of invulnerability. One striking feature of Little's early years was his mobility. While many children are anchored by family and school, he was increasingly adrift, moving between homes, neighborhoods, and even states. Each relocation served to isolate him further from stable influences and exposed him to new environments where law enforcement was inconsistent and societal oversight was fragmented. This mobility would later become a signature aspect of his criminal methodology, allowing him to commit murders across the United States with a chilling efficiency that baffled investigators for decades. In hindsight, the seeds of a transient killer were planted during these years of instability, long before any single murder had been committed. During this period, Little also developed a disturbing fascination with women and their vulnerabilities. Interviews and confessions decades later reveal that he began to fixate on certain types of women, particularly those living on the margins of society, such as drug users, sex workers, and transient individuals. These were not random fixations, but deliberate assessments, born from a mix of early experiences, personal compulsions, and an emerging understanding of who he could dominate and exploit. While many adolescents experiment with attraction, Little's thoughts were already entwined with predatory intentions. His early encounters with women, often violent and coercive, were precursors to the systematic killings that would dominate his adult life. The 1960s saw Samuel Little transition from minor criminality to more serious offenses, though the public and law enforcement were largely unaware of the trajectory he was following. Arrests for theft, assault, and other misdemeanors peppered his early adult record, but these charges were insufficient to recognize the pattern emerging beneath the surface. For Little, these interactions with law enforcement were not deterrents, but training grounds. He learned to lie, manipulate, and exploit gaps in the system. Each release, each minimal sentence, reinforced the belief that he could operate with impunity, a dangerous combination of skill, patience, and moral detachment that would make him one of America's most elusive killers. It is impossible to separate Little's childhood from his eventual transformation into a serial killer. Psychologists studying his life often emphasize that trauma and neglect do not cause serial killing in a direct, linear way, yet in Samuel Little's case, the correlation is stark. Early exposure to violence, instability in family structures, and lack of accountability created the psychological architecture for someone who could commit repeated murders without remorse. These formative experiences were amplified by a keen intelligence, strategic thinking, and the ability to read people, a lethal combination that made him unusually effective in avoiding detection for decades. Little himself, in interviews after his eventual capture, often reflected on his early life with a combination of clarity and detachment. He spoke of anger, loneliness, and the sense of being constantly on the outside looking in. Yet, there was also a chilling admission of awareness. He knew he was different, knew that the urges he felt were unacceptable, and in some ways took a perverse satisfaction in the control he exerted over others. This duality, self-awareness coupled with moral disengagement, would remain a hallmark of his psychological profile throughout his life. Family dynamics also played a significant role in shaping Little's psyche. Though his mother was a stabilizing presence at times, she struggled to manage the chaos surrounding her household. Siblings and extended family offered limited support, and Samuel's interactions were often characterized by conflict and aggression. Experts suggest that the combination of neglect and sporadic affection can create deep-seated insecurities, which, when coupled with innate predispositions toward violence, can manifest in destructive behaviors. In Little's case, this mix of environmental stressors and psychological traits was deadly, setting the stage for a life defined by crime and ultimately Murder, an often overlooked aspect of Samuel Little's formative years, is the social environment of mid-20th century America, particularly for African Americans in the South. Segregation, systemic poverty, and widespread discrimination formed a backdrop of struggle and marginalization. While many navigated these challenges without turning to violence, for Little, these conditions provided both opportunities and justifications for his actions. Vulnerable populations became targets, not only because of accessibility, but because his worldview, shaped in part by his environment, normalized exploitation and dehumanization. Even before his first confirmed murder, Samuel Little's adolescence and early adulthood were marked by a pattern of escalating aggression, manipulation, and criminal experimentation. These years were the proving grounds for the behavioral and psychological patterns that would later define his life. His intelligence, patience, and adaptability were already apparent, coupled with a chilling ability to compartmentalize and rationalize harmful behavior. By the time he crossed the threshold into homicide, he was not a man suddenly overcome by darkness. He was the culmination of decades of environmental pressure, psychological predisposition, and learned survival strategies, all coalescing into the mind of a serial killer. Understanding Samuel Little's childhood and early years is critical not only to grasp the origins of his crimes, but also to appreciate the complexity of human behavior under extreme conditions. His story challenges simplistic notions of evil, offering instead a nuanced portrait of how neglect, trauma, and environment can intersect with individual predisposition to produce one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Every theft, every act of aggression, every early encounter with authority was a stepping stone on a path that would eventually claim 93 confirmed victims, leaving a legacy of horror that spanned decades and touched lives across the nation. In these shadows of his formative years, the chilling narrative of Samuel Little began, quietly, invisibly, until it erupted into the national consciousness decades later, revealing a mind capable of unimaginable cruelty, yet shaped by a life that began in neglect and despair. Chapter 2: Streets of Survival, Adolescence, Crime, and Early Violence. Samuel Little's adolescence unfolded in an environment where survival was often the only guiding principle. The streets of the segregated South offered little in the way of safety, education, or opportunity, and for a young boy already wrestling with trauma and aggression, they became a proving ground. By his teenage years, Little was navigating a world that demanded cunning, vigilance, and, at times, ruthlessness. He moved through neighborhoods where danger lurked in every corner, where authority figures were inconsistent or absent, and where personal strength was measured by the ability to endure, manipulate, and sometimes intimidate others into submission. Early on, Little demonstrated a remarkable capacity for reading people and situations, a skill that would later serve him in the meticulous selection of victims. Even as a teenager, he could identify vulnerabilities in those around him, noting who was isolated, who was fearful, and who could be coerced or controlled. This combination of observation and opportunism was honed on the streets, where the weak were preyed upon and the strong dominated. While many adolescents developed street smarts, Little's intelligence was coupled with a cold detachment and emerging violence that set him apart. It was the first glimpse of a mind capable of calculating harm with precision that in his teenage years, Little's criminal behavior escalated from minor infractions to more serious offenses, including theft, assault, and fights with other youths. These acts were not only symptomatic of his anger and instability, but also instructional, teaching him how to manipulate situations, evade consequences, and exert control over others. Each encounter with the law, however brief, reinforced the notion that he could operate with minimal accountability. In these formative years, he learned that fear could be wielded as a weapon, and that people often overlooked the quiet, observant boy until he acted decisively. One of the most critical aspects of this period in Little's life was his exposure to violence in both personal and social contexts. Street fights, domestic instability, and the broader societal inequalities of the American South created a constant backdrop of aggression and unpredictability. These experiences were formative, teaching him not just how to survive, but how to dominate. By internalizing the lessons of intimidation and control, Little was cultivating the psychological tools that would later make him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. While most adolescents develop empathy through their interactions with peers, Little's experiences fostered detachment, a sense of invincibility, and a growing moral disconnection from the pain of others. During these years, Little also became increasingly mobile. Family instability and his own growing restlessness led him to move frequently, often drifting between cities and states. Each new location offered anonymity, a fresh set of opportunities, and a chance to observe new communities. This mobility, which may have appeared as aimlessness to outsiders, was in fact laying the groundwork for the patterns that would later define his murders. He was learning to blend in, to move undetected, and to exploit the gaps in societal oversight, a skill set that would make him exceptionally difficult to apprehend once his killings escalated. Little's encounters with women during adolescence reveal early patterns of predation. Even before committing his first confirmed murder, he displayed an alarming interest in controlling and manipulating women, particularly those on the fringes of society. Interviews conducted decades later indicate that these early encounters were exploratory, a testing of boundaries that would eventually evolve into systematic exploitation. Vulnerable women, isolated from protective social networks, were often his focus. This emerging pattern demonstrated both a psychological compulsion and an opportunistic intelligence, as he assessed who could be controlled and how, all while maintaining a veneer of normalcy to avoid detection. The intersection of environment, psychology, and early criminality is evident in these years. Little's experiences illustrate how childhood trauma, social neglect, and exposure to violence can converge with innate tendencies to produce behaviors that escalate over time. For Samuel Little, adolescence was not merely a transitional phase, but a period of refinement. He was honing his ability to manipulate, to intimidate, and to harm, while also developing an understanding of how society's blind spots could be exploited. Each fight, theft, or act of coercion contributed to a growing confidence in his ability to dominate those around him, a confidence that would later manifest in far more sinister ways. Education, or the lack thereof, played a role in shaping his adolescent trajectory. Little was largely disengaged from school, both academically and socially. Formal education did little to channel his intelligence into constructive outlets, and social interactions often reinforced his feelings of alienation and resentment. With minimal guidance and few positive role models, the streets became his classroom. Here, he learned the rules of power, the mechanics of fear, and the ways in which his own presence could be leveraged to achieve control over others. These lessons, while morally corrosive, were instrumental in the development of the behaviors that would characterize his adult criminality. It is important to note that while these years were formative, they were not universally marked by overt criminality. There were periods of relative quiet, times when Little worked odd jobs or attempted to navigate the world in ways that mimicked conventional life. However, these moments were temporary interludes, often punctuated by frustration, anger, and ultimately, violent impulses. The duality of his adolescence, a blend of ordinary survival and extraordinary deviance, foreshadowed the complexity of his later life. It was a life that oscillated between the visible and the hidden, the mundane and the monstrous, a tension that would define his existence for decades. By the time he reached early adulthood, Samuel Little had already internalized the behaviors, instincts, and psychological patterns that would allow him to commit murder on an unprecedented scale. His adolescence was a crucible, forging both the strategies and the emotional detachment that would later enable him to move across the United States, evade law enforcement, and prey on women with chilling efficiency. Understanding these years is essential to understanding Samuel Little himself, for it is within these streets of survival that the contours of a prolific serial killer first took shape, invisible to the world but inevitable in hindsight. As Samuel Little transitioned fully into adulthood, the lessons learned on the streets became more pronounced, shaping not only his behavior, but also his understanding of how to operate undetected. By the early 1960s, he was no longer merely a youth testing boundaries. He had become a young man fully aware of the power he could wield over others. The streets that had been his classroom were now the stage on which he would refine the instincts and strategies that would allow him to commit crimes across decades with minimal interference. These early years of self-directed learning, often punctuated by arrests for minor offenses, theft, and altercations, were crucial in cultivating his cunning and his ability to anticipate the reactions of law enforcement and potential victims. One of the defining characteristics of this period was Little's increasing mobility. Unlike many who remain anchored to a particular community, he moved frequently between cities, states, and regions, learning to blend into diverse environments while remaining undetected. These movements were not random but strategic, allowing him to explore new territories, assess potential targets, and practice the art of invisibility. This nomadic lifestyle became a core feature of his later criminal career. It not only provided him with access to a broad range of victims, but also made patterns difficult to detect. Authorities decades later would struggle to connect murders spanning states and years, largely because these formative experiences had taught Little the value of constant motion and adaptability. During this time, Little's interactions with women reveal early evidence of predatory behavior. He was drawn to those who were vulnerable, often targeting individuals living on the fringes of society, including women struggling with poverty, addiction, or marginalization. These interactions, while initially exploratory and non-lethal, allowed him to practice coercion and manipulation. He learned how to approach, charm, and control his targets without immediately arousing suspicion, creating a foundation for the more sinister behaviors that would later define his criminal portfolio. These encounters also reveal a disturbing insight into his psychology, an almost clinical assessment of weakness and opportunity, a skill that would make him extraordinarily effective as a serial predator. Despite the chaos of his early adult life, Little's intelligence and strategic thinking were evident. Unlike impulsive criminals whose actions often lead to immediate capture, he learned patience, discretion, and careful planning. He observed how law enforcement operated, identifying weaknesses in their procedures and exploiting gaps in oversight. Every arrest, every release, every brush with authority became a lesson in evasion. This ability to learn from experience, to anticipate consequences, and to adapt accordingly would prove invaluable as he moved into the phase of his life that would define him historically: murder. These years were also marked by moments of tension between Little's internal compulsions and the social realities he navigated. In interviews later in life, he admitted to violent urges and the early formation of homicidal fantasies. While many young men experience aggression or desire, Little's impulses were persistent, methodical, and increasingly difficult to suppress. He began to imagine scenarios in which he could dominate, harm, and control victims, often visualizing acts of violence in disturbing detail. This internal landscape, though hidden from the world, guided his actions and made him acutely aware of the opportunities and vulnerabilities present in his surroundings. That Little's adolescence and early adulthood also reveal the role of social marginalization in shaping criminal behavior. Growing up African American in the segregated South, he encountered systemic inequality, discrimination, and social exclusion. These societal pressures, coupled with his personal experiences of neglect and instability, created a sense of detachment from conventional morality and social norms. While these factors alone do not produce serial killers, in Little's case, they interacted with his psychological traits to reinforce behaviors of exploitation, manipulation, and ultimately, violence. Vulnerable communities became both his hunting ground and a reflection of the systemic gaps he could exploit with impunity. To be why the mid-1960s, Samuel Little's reputation in the underworld had begun to take shape. While not widely known publicly, those who interacted with him informally, friends, acquaintances, and criminal peers, recognized a man who was dangerous, unpredictable, and yet remarkably controlled. He could switch between charm and menace, blending into normalcy while harboring dangerous compulsions. This duality made him both effective and invisible, a figure who could navigate public spaces without drawing suspicion while secretly cultivating his darker impulses. That Little's early adult life also highlights the interplay between opportunity and compulsion. His mobility, intelligence, and acute observational skills created a fertile environment for predatory behavior, while his internal compulsions drove him to act. He was learning, experimenting, and refining his techniques, often in small, seemingly inconsequential ways. Each act, each manipulation, each confrontation contributed to a growing repertoire of skills that would later make him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. In retrospect, it is clear that his adolescence and early adulthood were not merely a prelude, but an essential training ground, shaping both the methods and the mindset that would define decades of murder. Understanding this period is crucial to understanding Samuel Little himself. It demonstrates how a combination of environmental pressures, social neglect, early exposure to violence, and individual psychological predispositions can intersect to produce patterns of behavior that escalate over time. By the time he fully entered the criminal landscape as a murderer, he had already internalized lessons in mobility, manipulation, and predation. He had honed the ability to identify vulnerability, exploit opportunities, and navigate societal blind spots with a precision that would confound law enforcement for decades. In these streets of survival, the foundations of a serial killer were laid. The patterns, compulsions, and strategies that would later facilitate the murders of 93 confirmed victims, likely far more, were born not in sudden acts of evil, but in the slow accumulation of knowledge, experience, and psychological conditioning. Samuel Little's adolescence and early adulthood reveal a trajectory shaped by circumstance, intelligence, and dark compulsion, a trajectory that would carry him across the United States and into the annals of criminal history as one of the most prolific and disturbing killers the nation has ever known. Chapter 3: First Blood, Little's Initial Murders and Early Patterns. As Samuel Little crossed fully into adulthood, the latent darkness that had been cultivated through years of instability, aggression, and compulsive behavior began to manifest in far more violent and irrevocable ways. The first confirmed murders attributed to him did not arrive as a sudden eruption of evil, but as the natural evolution of a life steeped in neglect, trauma, and exposure to the harsh realities of survival. By the late 1960s, Little was already experimenting with boundaries, learning not only how to assert power over others, but also how to exploit vulnerabilities in society, a skill set that would make his eventual descent into serial killing disturbingly methodical. The early murders were marked by patterns that, in hindsight, reveal the careful observation and strategic thinking that would become hallmarks of his criminal career. Samuel Little primarily targeted women who were isolated, marginalized, or struggling with societal disadvantage. Many of these women were involved in prostitution, battling addiction, or living transient lifestyles. This focus was neither random nor impulsive. It was a deliberate selection process informed by years of experience navigating the streets, reading people, and assessing risk. Little had learned to identify those who could not easily summon help, those whose disappearances might attract minimal scrutiny, and those who could be controlled with relative ease. The method of his early killings was both brutal and personal, yet executed with an efficiency that minimized exposure. He often used strangulation, a method that allowed him intimate control over his victims while leaving limited forensic evidence, a fact that later challenged law enforcement in confirming the full scope of his crimes. Interviews with Little in later years revealed a chilling clarity about his methods. He admitted that strangulation provided a dual function. It fulfilled a psychological compulsion while also serving as a practical means of ensuring that his victims could not resist or identify him. Each early murder was thus both an act of compulsion and a calculated maneuver, reflecting the intersection of psychology and technique. Even in these early acts, Little displayed a capacity for concealment and evasion that would become legendary. He learned to select locations, often secluded or transient spaces, that reduced the likelihood of discovery. He monitored neighborhoods, noting when the streets were empty or when potential witnesses were distracted. These initial murders were not chaotic or accidental. They were exercises in precision and observation, guided by a mind that had spent decades learning to exploit human behavior and societal blind spots. His ability to operate under the radar would eventually allow him to commit dozens of murders across multiple states without detection for decades. The psychological implications of these early murders are profound. Unlike impulsive killers, whose first acts are often chaotic and poorly planned, Little's initial killings reveal a chilling blend of compulsion, forethought, and strategic selection. He was fully aware of the consequences of discovery, yet he allowed his impulses to dominate, carefully balancing the risk of capture against the satisfaction of exerting control. For criminologists and psychologists examining his life, these early acts were indicative not just of burgeoning violence, but of the development of a sophisticated and predatory mindset, one that would guide nearly every action in his subsequent criminal career. The victims of Samuel Little's early murders often shared common life circumstances, but they were also individuals with histories, struggles, and humanity. Many were women grappling with marginalization and hardship, women whom society had largely failed. Little's selection of such victims was both opportunistic and predatory. By targeting those whom law enforcement might overlook or dismiss, he ensured a degree of protection from scrutiny while simultaneously fulfilling his psychological and sexual compulsions. This interplay between opportunity and desire became a defining feature of his modus operandi, setting a precedent for decades of serial killings that would later shock the nation. As these early murders accumulated, Samuel Little's understanding of human behavior deepened. He became adept at reading reactions, recognizing fear, and manipulating compliance. Victims who resisted were subdued through sheer physical force or psychological intimidation, while those who hesitated could be coaxed into vulnerable positions through charm or feigned familiarity. These skills, honed over years of observing society and navigating the streets, transformed him into a predator who was not only violent, but exceptionally skilled at exploiting the weaknesses of those around him. In essence, he combined predatory intelligence with compulsion, producing a lethal synergy that would characterize his entire criminal career. Law enforcement during this period often failed to connect the dots. The early murders occurred across different cities and states, involving victims from marginalized populations whose disappearances might not have immediately triggered investigative urgency. This geographic spread, combined with the subtlety of his methods and the lack of consistent reporting mechanisms for vulnerable populations, allowed Little to continue his killings without significant interruption. In hindsight, these early murders reveal the beginnings of a pattern that would later become unmistakable. The mobility, the victim profile, and the calculated concealment of evidence that defined his notorious career. Samuel Little's early acts of homicide also illustrate the interplay between psychological gratification and strategic planning. The compulsion to kill, though deeply disturbing, was intertwined with careful observation and tactical decision-making. He did not act recklessly. He acted with awareness, precision, and purpose. Each murder became a learning experience, refining his methods, reinforcing his sense of control, and deepening the detachment from conventional morality that allowed him to continue with little regard for the human cost. These initial killings serve as a critical lens through which to understand the evolution of a serial killer. They are not isolated acts of violence, but the foundation upon which decades of murder would be constructed. The early murders of Samuel Little reveal a man who was both predator and strategist, whose childhood traumas and adolescent experiences had matured into a sophisticated understanding of how to exploit human vulnerabilities. In these first acts of homicide, one can trace the emergence of patterns, the honing of methods, and the chilling beginning of a criminal trajectory that would eventually encompass 93 confirmed victims and countless more whose stories may never be fully known. The early murders of Samuel Little were not just acts of violence. They were exercises in learning, refinement, and the development of a chilling methodology that would define his criminal career. Each killing provided him with insight into human behavior, opportunity, and risk management. By observing reactions, anticipating behaviors, and evaluating the vulnerabilities of his victims, Little gradually honed a pattern that combined compulsion with strategic precision. He learned not only how to overpower his victims, but also how to remain invisible in the aftermath, a skill that would allow him to operate across multiple states without immediate detection. These formative murders also illustrate a psychological evolution. Little's compulsions were intensifying, yet they were now being paired with careful observation and calculation. He did not rely solely on brute force. He studied environments, monitored routines, and selected locations that minimized the chance of discovery. Early on, he began to appreciate the effectiveness of mobility, recognizing that moving from city to city and state to state offered a buffer against law enforcement and allowed him to reset patterns before they could be traced. This insight, born from both instinct and experience, would become central to the scope and scale of his later killings. The victims of this period reveal the careful choices that defined Little's early patterns. Women who were socially isolated, economically disadvantaged, or struggling with substance abuse were frequent targets. This was not mere opportunism, but a calculated understanding of risk and accessibility. By focusing on women whose absences were less likely to prompt immediate investigation, he ensured that he could carry out his acts with minimal interference. Each encounter with a vulnerable woman provided a framework for future crimes, reinforcing methods of approach, control, and execution that would carry through decades of murder. Little's interactions with law enforcement during this period were largely inconsequential, yet they played a critical role in shaping his confidence and methods. Arrests for minor crimes, occasional detentions, or confrontations with authorities were treated as learning experiences rather than deterrents. He observed how officers operated, noted procedural gaps, and learned to anticipate questions or investigations. These experiences reinforced a growing sense of invincibility. By the time his killings were fully underway, he had internalized strategies for evasion, manipulation, and self-preservation that allowed him to exploit systemic weaknesses in law enforcement across multiple jurisdictions. Another striking aspect of Little's early murders is his ability to compartmentalize. While most individuals experience moral conflict, guilt, or anxiety after causing harm, Little exhibited a remarkable capacity to detach from the human consequences of his actions. Interviews conducted decades later reveal a man who could reflect on the suffering he inflicted with almost clinical dispassion, describing his early victims and the methods of killing with a disturbing clarity. This emotional detachment, coupled with keen observational skills, allowed him to continue killing without succumbing to detection or self-sabotage, and it would remain a hallmark of his psychological profile throughout his criminal life. The geographic spread of these early murders is also noteworthy. By moving from city to city and state to state, Little not only reduced the likelihood of patterns being detected, but also diversified his hunting grounds. This mobility allowed him to experiment with methods, select targets based on situational advantage, and refine his approach in a variety of environments. Each new location presented both opportunities and challenges, yet he navigated them with the same calculated attention that defined his early pattern of homicide. In retrospect, these movements foreshadowed the staggering national scale of his later confirmed killings, demonstrating that his early murders were not isolated incidents, but the beginning of a sprawling and systematic approach to serial killing. The combination of compulsion, intelligence, and strategy in these early acts reveals a deeply troubling portrait of a predator. Samuel Little was not motivated by random anger or transient emotion. He was guided by a calculated understanding of opportunity, control, and concealment. Each early murder was a step in a process of refinement, a rehearsal that would eventually enable him to claim 93 confirmed victims while evading capture for decades. The chilling consistency of these early patterns underscores the depth of his predatory instincts and the meticulous development of skills that would define him as one of America's most prolific serial killers. It is also important to consider the broader societal context in which these early murders occurred. During the 1960s, systems for tracking missing persons, particularly those from marginalized communities, were often inadequate. Women who were homeless, addicted, or involved in sex work were disproportionately overlooked by law enforcement, providing Little with the perfect environment in which to operate. This societal neglect, combined with his psychological tendencies and strategic acumen, created the conditions for an unprecedented killing spree. In this sense, the early murders of Samuel Little were not merely acts of individual violence, but also a reflection of systemic vulnerabilities that he would continue to exploit throughout his life. Understanding these initial killings is essential to grasping the trajectory of Samuel Little's criminal career. They provide a window into the early development of patterns, methods, and psychological traits that would persist for decades. His early victims, while tragically forgotten by society at the time, were the foundation upon which a terrifyingly effective method of murder was constructed. The first blood spilled by Samuel Little was not an isolated incident. It was the opening chapter in a narrative of calculated predation, mobility, and emotional detachment that would eventually define the deadliest serial killer in American history. Through these early acts, the transformation from troubled youth to methodical killer becomes visible. Samuel Little was learning, practicing, and refining in real time, cultivating an expertise in predation that would allow him to elude justice while taking lives across the country. His initial murders were both formative and revelatory, illustrating how early compulsion, combined with strategic thinking and societal vulnerabilities, can culminate in a criminal career of staggering magnitude. The patterns established in this period, mobility, victim selection, concealment, and emotional detachment, would become the blueprint for decades of murder, setting the stage for the terrifying legacy that would eventually make Samuel Little a name synonymous with America's darkest chapters of serial homicide. Chapter 4: Life on the Run, Mobility, Secrecy, and Victims Across States. By the mid-1960s, Samuel Little had fully transitioned into a life defined by mobility, secrecy, and predation. The early murders that marked his entry into homicide were not isolated events, but the prelude to a career that would span decades, multiple states, and dozens of victims. Little's nomadic lifestyle became both a shield and a weapon, allowing him to operate with alarming freedom, evade law enforcement, and refine his methods over years without interruption. Unlike many criminals who are eventually caught due to patterns, Little's movements rendered him invisible, a shadow slipping through cities and towns with a terrifying efficiency that would take decades to fully comprehend. Mobility was central to Little's ability to remain undetected. He did not settle in one city or community. Instead, he drifted across states, often disappearing for months at a time. This transient existence allowed him to pursue victims in different locations, exploit gaps in law enforcement coordination, and prevent patterns from emerging that might have led to his capture. By moving frequently, he reduced the likelihood that authorities could connect one disappearance to another, creating a dispersed network of crimes that, at the time, appeared unrelated. Each new city provided not only a fresh hunting ground, but also a reset, a way to operate free from suspicion and scrutiny. During this period, Little's understanding of human behavior became increasingly sophisticated. He observed communities, noting which areas were poorly patrolled, which populations were marginalized, and which individuals were most vulnerable. Women living transient lifestyles, struggling with addiction, or working in precarious conditions became his primary targets. These were individuals who, due to social neglect or systemic vulnerabilities, were less likely to prompt immediate investigation. Little's ability to identify opportunity and vulnerability was a defining trait, allowing him to strike with precision while minimizing the risk of detection. This keen observational skill, combined with a predatory instinct, turned him into a highly effective killer operating under the radar for decades. Secrecy was another critical component of his strategy. Little's killings were rarely impulsive acts carried out in the heat of the moment. They were calculated, deliberate, and carefully concealed. He chose locations that minimized the risk of discovery, often abandoned buildings, quiet streets, or transient shelters, and took care to ensure that the bodies of his victims were left in places where they might not be immediately found. This meticulous approach to concealment, paired with his mobility, created a level of operational security that baffled investigators for years. Each murder was not merely an act of compulsion, but a carefully orchestrated operation, reflecting both patience and cunning. The victims during this mobile period demonstrate a consistent pattern, revealing the methodology that would define Little's criminal life. He sought women who were socially isolated, economically disadvantaged, and physically vulnerable. Many were involved in sex work, battling addiction, or living transient lifestyles. By focusing on individuals whose absences were less likely to trigger investigation, Little ensured that he could continue his killings with minimal interference. This approach, while chilling, also reflects a disturbing intelligence. He understood how societal neglect could be exploited to facilitate repeated acts of violence. Each murder became both a psychological fulfillment and a strategic exercise, reinforcing techniques that would later allow him to commit scores of additional killings without detection. Little's ability to remain undetected during this period was also facilitated by the lack of coordinated law enforcement systems across states. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was limited communication between police departments regarding missing persons, particularly those from marginalized communities. Little exploited these systemic gaps, knowing that the disappearance of a transient woman in one city might not be connected to another case in a different state. This understanding, coupled with his mobility, allowed him to operate on a national scale while appearing local, creating a web of murders that would take decades to untangle. Despite the severity of his actions, Little often maintained a facade of normalcy in public life. To outsiders, he appeared as a transient worker, a man moving from job to job, city to city, with no apparent motive for suspicion. This duality, the ability to blend seamlessly into society while committing heinous crimes, was a hallmark of his success. It also underscores the terrifying reality that serial killers often exist alongside ordinary lives, unnoticed and underestimated until patterns emerge long after the crimes have begun. The psychological implications of his mobile lifestyle are significant. By constantly moving, Little was able to reinforce a sense of control and detachment. Each new location was a stage upon which he could exert dominance, select targets, and fulfill compulsions without the encumbrance of familiarity or potential accountability. The transient nature of his life allowed him to compartmentalize, separating the act of murder from the consequences and the moral reality of his victim's suffering. This ability to emotionally distance himself while actively seeking new victims contributed to the longevity and scope of his criminal career. In addition, Little's mobility allowed him to experiment with his methods, learning which approaches were most effective and which locations offered optimal concealment. He observed reactions, noted patterns of vulnerability, and adapted his behavior accordingly. Each murder became both a compulsion and a learning experience, providing insights that would inform future killings. Over time, these experiences accumulated into an operational expertise that made him not only a prolific killer, but an exceptionally skilled one, capable of evading law enforcement for decades while leaving a trail of victims spanning the United States. Through this period of mobility and secrecy, Samuel Little evolved into a predator whose reach and effectiveness were unparalleled. His early understanding of opportunity, combined with meticulous concealment and an ability to exploit societal vulnerabilities, allowed him to commit murders with a chilling efficiency. The mobility that began as a means of survival in a turbulent youth had transformed into a tool for predation, enabling him to operate across states and evade capture for decades. Each new city, each new victim, reinforced patterns and methods that would come to define the darkest chapters of his criminal life, establishing Samuel Little as a name that would eventually be synonymous with America's deadliest serial killing spree. As Samuel Little's years of mobility extended through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, his methods and approach to killing became increasingly sophisticated. While the streets of his youth had taught him survival and observation, adulthood honed his predatory instincts into a terrifying combination of patience, strategy, and compulsion. Little's nomadic existence was no longer simply a means of personal survival. It had become a deliberate strategy for sustaining his criminal enterprise. Each relocation was calculated, each encounter with potential victims carefully assessed, and each murder executed with chilling precision. This period of his life demonstrates a terrifying duality: the ability to exist publicly as a seemingly ordinary man, while privately orchestrating acts of extreme violence. Little's public persona, an unassuming transient, a casual worker, a man blending into neighborhoods, was meticulously maintained to avoid suspicion. To acquaintances, neighbors, and even some employers, he appeared harmless, approachable, even ordinary. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy was a calculated predator, a man who could identify vulnerability, manipulate opportunity, and commit murder without leaving obvious traces. This ability to navigate dual realities contributed directly to his ability to commit murders across states without detection for decades. The victims during this mobile period were chosen with remarkable consistency. Little's selection criteria reveal both opportunism and strategic calculation. Women who were socially isolated, economically disadvantaged, or struggling with addiction were disproportionately targeted. Many were sex workers, transient individuals, or women living on the margins of society. Populations historically neglected by law enforcement, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s. By focusing on these groups, Little reduced the likelihood of immediate investigation, allowing him to strike repeatedly without drawing attention. Each victim represented both an outlet for compulsion and a calculated exploitation of societal vulnerability. Little's methodology during this time also highlights the interplay between psychological compulsion and operational strategy. Strangulation remained his primary method of killing, providing both the intimacy and control he sought and a means of minimizing evidence. He studied his victims' behaviors, observing when they were isolated or distracted, ensuring the timing and execution of his crimes minimized risk. These murders were neither haphazard nor impulsive. They were exercises in planning, observation, and control. Even at this early stage of his national mobility, the sophistication of his methods demonstrated a deep understanding of human behavior and the operational requirements of serial predation. One of the most chilling aspects of Little's life on the run was his ability to compartmentalize. He could transition seamlessly from one city to another, leaving behind a trail of murders while maintaining the appearance of a transient, working-class man. He understood that mobility was his ally. Every move allowed him to reset patterns, avoid scrutiny, and continue killing with minimal risk. In each new location, he assessed communities, monitored law enforcement activity, and selected victims with an unsettling efficiency. This ability to compartmentalize experience, morality, and emotion created a psychological armor that insulated him from guilt or fear of discovery, facilitating a killing spree that would eventually encompass 93 confirmed victims. During this period, his interactions with law enforcement were infrequent and largely inconsequential. Minor arrests for theft, assault, or public disturbances did little to impede his movement or criminal behavior. Each encounter with authority reinforced a growing confidence in his ability to evade capture. He learned to manipulate perceptions, craft narratives, and exploit gaps in systemic oversight. In retrospect, these early brushes with the law functioned less as deterrence and more as practical training in evasion, a skill set that would prove critical in sustaining a multi-decade killing spree. The mobility of Little's crimes also allowed him to experiment and refine his techniques. He adjusted methods based on the environment, testing different approaches to controlling victims and avoiding detection. Over time, these experiments became a sophisticated playbook of predation. Each murder informed the next, creating a feedback loop of compulsion and strategic learning. By the 1980s, he had developed a highly effective modus operandi: selection of marginalized victims, strategic planning, mobility across jurisdictions, and meticulous concealment. These early formative years were foundational, ensuring that when law enforcement began connecting dots decades later, the scale of his crimes would be staggering. Equally important is the societal context of this period. During the 1960s through the 1980s, communication between police departments, particularly across state lines, was limited. Missing persons reports for women on the margins were often deprioritized, and information sharing was minimal. Little exploited this systemic weakness with a frighteningly effective efficiency. He understood that patterns would be difficult to trace, particularly when the victims came from communities that were already neglected or stigmatized. His mobility, in combination with societal oversight failures, allowed him to operate as a predator on a national scale with near-total impunity. The combination of mobility, secrecy, and predation defines this period as critical in understanding Samuel Little's criminal evolution. These years were not simply a continuation of past behavior, but a deliberate refinement of strategy, method, and opportunity. His ability to move seamlessly across state lines, select and manipulate vulnerable victims, and evade law enforcement created a uniquely lethal profile, one that would eventually mark him as America's most prolific serial killer. Life on the run was both his shield and his tool, a vehicle that enabled a decades-long killing spree while maintaining the illusion of ordinariness in a world oblivious to the horrors unfolding in its midst. Through this period, the patterns that would come to define his career, mobility, selection of vulnerable victims, strategic concealment, and emotional detachment, were firmly established. Samuel Little's life on the run was not merely a consequence of circumstance. It was a deliberate and terrifying strategy that allowed him to claim lives across the nation, leaving a trail of tragedy that would take decades to fully reveal. In these years of mobility and secrecy, the scope, method, and chilling efficiency of his predation began to crystallize, setting the stage for the unprecedented body count that would ultimately etch his name into criminal history. Chapter 5: Patterns of Predation, Modus Operandi, and Psychological Profile. By the late 1970s, Samuel Little had evolved into a methodical predator, whose killings reflected not only compulsion, but also a meticulous understanding of human behavior and situational opportunity. His early murders, though horrifying, had served as a training ground, an incubation period during which he honed both his methods and his understanding of risk. By this point, Little was no longer simply reacting to impulse. He was executing carefully planned acts that combined psychological manipulation, strategic selection of victims, and an acute awareness of law enforcement vulnerabilities. Understanding these patterns is critical to appreciating how he became America's most prolific serial killer. One of the most distinctive aspects of Little's modus operandi was his consistent targeting of marginalized women. He rarely, if ever, selected victims outside the realms of vulnerability. These were women often overlooked by society, those struggling with addiction, working in sex industries, living transient lives, or otherwise isolated. This selection was both practical and psychological. From a practical standpoint, it allowed him to operate with a lower risk of immediate detection. Psychologically, these victims represented the ultimate object of control, individuals who, due to their marginalized status, could be manipulated, coerced, and ultimately dominated without significant interference. This consistency in victimology became a defining element of his predatory pattern. The method of killing itself was equally telling. Strangulation was Little's preferred technique, a method that satisfied both his psychological compulsions and operational needs. It allowed for intimate control over the victim, the physical manifestation of dominance, and a reduced likelihood of leaving forensic evidence compared to weapons or firearms. Interviews later revealed that he derived a sense of satisfaction from the act of strangulation itself, the pressure, the finality, and the control it afforded. Yet it was never reckless. It was always calculated, executed in a manner designed to limit risk and maximize control. Even in the execution of violence, there was a striking level of forethought. Mobility remained a central component of his strategy. Little's murders were scattered across states, cities, and communities, a pattern that served multiple functions. It prevented law enforcement from easily connecting cases, provided fresh targets, and allowed him to operate with minimal suspicion. Each new location presented its own set of challenges and opportunities, and Little adapted quickly. He observed neighborhood patterns, identified secluded spaces, and considered the likelihood of witnesses or police intervention. Over time, this adaptability became second nature, a critical skill that enabled him to maintain his killing spree for decades. Another key element of Little's modus operandi was his ability to manipulate victims psychologically before acting. He often used charm, feigned familiarity, or deceptive kindness to gain trust, making it easier to isolate and control his targets. His victims, frequently conditioned by prior experiences of marginalization or exploitation, were less likely to resist someone who initially appeared harmless or friendly. This manipulation was subtle yet effective, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and vulnerability. It was not brute force alone that defined Little's killings, but a combination of coercion, observation, and psychological exploitation. The consistency of his behavior over time reveals the hallmarks of a highly organized serial killer. Organized killers are typically characterized by careful planning, attention to detail, and methods that reduce the risk of detection. Little's murders fit this profile almost perfectly. Each act demonstrated forethought, a clear understanding of the environment, and an anticipation of consequences. Unlike disorganized killers, whose crimes may be erratic or impulsive, Little's killings exhibited control, patience, and strategic thinking. Over time, patterns emerged not only in victim selection but also in timing, location, and execution, illustrating a chilling level of expertise that allowed him to operate undetected for decades. Psychological profiling of Samuel Little highlights additional elements that distinguished him from other killers. He exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, including a lack of empathy, disregard for societal norms, and chronic deception. However, he also demonstrated high intelligence, acute observational skills, and the capacity for strategic planning. This combination, psychopathy tempered by intelligence, made him exceptionally effective. He could navigate social spaces, avoid suspicion, and select victims based on careful assessment of opportunity and risk. Understanding this psychological profile is crucial to comprehending both his methodology and his ability to evade detection over decades. That Little's killings also reveal a deeply personal compulsion intertwined with his operational strategy. He often spoke about a need to kill, describing urges that were persistent and overpowering. These urges were coupled with a practical awareness of how to satisfy them safely, so to speak, from a self-preservation standpoint. This duality, Intense compulsion managed through careful planning was central to his success as a serial killer. It allowed him to continue for decades without interruption, each act reinforcing both his psychological satisfaction and his operational proficiency. Additionally, Little's mobility, victim selection, and concealment strategies exploited systemic weaknesses in law enforcement. During the period of his killings, communication between jurisdictions was limited, and missing persons investigations, especially for marginalized women, were often deprioritized. Little understood these gaps intuitively and operated within them, turning systemic inefficiencies into protective mechanisms for himself. Over time, these strategies coalesced into a methodical approach that allowed him to remain undetected while committing murders across multiple states, a testament to both his cunning and the vulnerabilities of the era's law enforcement infrastructure. By analyzing his early patterns, modus operandi, and psychological traits, a clear portrait emerges. Samuel Little was not a random or impulsive killer. He was a highly organized predator, motivated by compulsion but guided by intelligence, observation, and strategy. The consistent targeting of vulnerable women, the methodical use of strangulation, the mobility across jurisdictions, and the ability to manipulate both victims and law enforcement reveal a criminal mind operating with remarkable sophistication. Understanding these patterns is essential not only for comprehending Little's crimes, but also for appreciating the terrifying efficiency with which he executed them, ultimately leading to the deaths of 93 confirmed victims and leaving a legacy of horror that would resonate across decades. As Samuel Little's career progressed into the 1980s, the patterns established during his earlier years became increasingly refined, revealing a criminal mind operating at both compulsive and strategic levels. His murders were no longer isolated acts of predation, but part of a coherent, systematic approach that combined intimate control, mobility, and exploitation of societal vulnerabilities. Each killing was a reinforcement of method and mastery, illustrating a terrifying convergence of psychological compulsion and operational sophistication. By this stage, Little had developed what would later be recognized as his hallmark modus operandi: the consistent targeting of marginalized women, the use of strangulation as both tool and ritual, and the careful management of location, timing, and concealment to minimize detection. Little's focus on vulnerable women reveals a profound understanding of human and social dynamics. Many of his victims were women whose lives were marked by isolation, addiction, or marginalization, individuals whom society often ignored or dismissed. This selection was strategic as much as psychological. From a practical standpoint, these victims were less likely to prompt immediate investigation, allowing Little to act with reduced risk. From a psychological perspective, they were objects over which he could exert complete control. In interviews years later, Little described assessing vulnerabilities with clinical precision. He could quickly identify those who were isolated, fearful, or compliant, and exploit those traits to gain access and dominance. This skill in victim selection was as much a part of his predatory toolkit as the method of killing itself. The method of murder, strangulation, was both deliberate and symbolic in Little's crimes. Strangulation allowed for close physical control, requiring both strength and attention, and it fulfilled an internal compulsion to dominate and immobilize. Unlike more impersonal methods, strangulation offered psychological gratification. It provided a direct, tactile experience of control, the ability to dictate the final moments of another human being's life. Little's choice of this method also reflected his intelligence and strategic thinking. It minimized the risk of leaving clear forensic evidence, especially during an era when DNA analysis was non-existent and law enforcement techniques were limited. Each act of strangulation was both an expression of compulsion and a calculated maneuver designed to sustain his predatory activities over time. Mobility continued to be central to Little's survival and operational success. He did not remain confined to a single community or region. Rather, he moved fluidly between cities and states, adapting his approach to each new environment. Each location offered different opportunities, risks, and challenges, and Little's adaptability ensured that he could exploit circumstances effectively. He carefully observed neighborhoods, identified areas where he could isolate victims, and calculated the likelihood of witnesses or law enforcement presence. This strategic mobility made pattern recognition exceedingly difficult for investigators and allowed him to operate on a national scale, a factor that would contribute to the staggering number of confirmed victims over subsequent decades. Psychological analysis of Samuel Little highlights the integration of compulsion, intelligence, and detachment. He exhibited classic traits of psychopathy: lack of empathy, superficial charm, manipulativeness, and a profound disregard for societal rules. Yet he coupled these traits with acute observational skills, strategic thinking, and long-term planning. This combination made him exceptionally effective, allowing him to navigate public spaces unnoticed, select victims with precision, and execute murders without raising immediate suspicion. Unlike disorganized killers, whose impulsivity often leads to rapid capture, Little's organized approach, strategic, patient, and informed by deep observation, enabled a multi-decade killing spree that challenged law enforcement across multiple jurisdictions. Another striking feature of Little's predatory behavior during this period was his use of psychological manipulation. He often presented himself as familiar, friendly, or harmless, employing charm and deceptive kindness to gain trust. Many of his victims, conditioned by prior experiences of marginalization or trauma, were less likely to resist someone who initially appeared approachable. This manipulation, subtle yet effective, allowed him to isolate victims with minimal confrontation. He understood that fear, coercion, and psychological exploitation were as critical as physical control in ensuring compliance and minimizing the risk of discovery. Each act of manipulation reinforced his sense of dominance and provided valuable feedback for future interactions. The systemic context of his crimes cannot be understated. During the 1970s and 1980s, communication between police jurisdictions was fragmented, and missing persons investigations, particularly those involving marginalized women, were often deprioritized. Little intuitively exploited these weaknesses, operating across state lines with an understanding of how delays, miscommunication, and societal neglect created opportunities for continued predation. This combination of intelligence, mobility, and insight into institutional gaps made him exceptionally difficult to apprehend and allowed him to sustain a pattern of murder that spanned decades. By the mid-1980s, Samuel Little had perfected a pattern of predation that blended compulsion, strategy, and adaptive intelligence. Each murder followed a recognizable blueprint: selection of a vulnerable victim, approach with calculated manipulation, execution through strangulation, concealment of the body, and movement to a new location. Yet within this structure, there was room for adaptation, adjusting methods based on circumstance, opportunity, and perceived risk. This ability to combine consistency with flexibility ensured both psychological gratification and practical evasion, cementing Little's status as one of the most effective serial predators in American history. The integration of compulsion, intelligence, and operational strategy provides a chilling insight into Little's criminal psyche. He was both a victim of his own urges and a master of execution, capable of translating violent compulsion into a systematic pattern of murder that spanned decades. Understanding this psychological and methodological framework is crucial for comprehending the full scope of his crimes, the staggering number of victims, and the decades-long evasion of justice that allowed him to claim lives across the United States with devastating efficiency. Through the lens of modus operandi and psychological profiling, the portrait of Samuel Little emerges, a highly organized, intelligent, and adaptive predator who combined compulsion with strategy, emotional detachment, with acute observation, and mobility with meticulous concealment. These traits, established during his early years of violence and refined over decades, explain both the scale of his crimes and the challenges law enforcement faced in identifying, connecting, and ultimately confirming the extent of his killing spree. His life and patterns of predation remain a sobering study in the intersections of psychology, opportunity, and human vulnerability. Chapter 6: The Hunting Ground, Cities, Communities, and Victim Selection. As Samuel Little's criminal career advanced into the 1980s and beyond, his understanding of environment, opportunity, and human behavior reached a level of disturbing sophistication. He was no longer merely a transient killer acting on compulsion. He had become a calculated predator whose approach to victim selection and territory demonstrated an eerie precision. Every city he entered, every neighborhood he traversed, became a hunting ground in which he could observe, assess, and exploit vulnerabilities, creating a systematic framework for murder that would span decades and ultimately claim 93 confirmed victims. That Little's choice of location was never incidental. Cities and communities were analyzed in terms of opportunity, isolation, and law enforcement response. He gravitated toward urban environments where marginalized populations were more likely to be present, areas where women were isolated, transient, or involved in high-risk behaviors, such as sex work or substance abuse. These were populations often neglected by society, whose disappearances were less likely to trigger immediate investigation. In his own recounting years later, Little explained how he would study a city, noting which streets were quiet at night, which buildings were abandoned or underutilized, and where he could easily find and manipulate vulnerable women. Each location was evaluated for risk, opportunity, and potential concealment, highlighting his methodical approach to predation. The communities Little targeted reveal a chilling understanding of social dynamics. He often focused on neighborhoods where residents were preoccupied with survival, marginalized by systemic inequality, or transient in nature. In these spaces, he could operate with relative impunity. He would identify patterns of daily life, learn when potential victims would be alone, and exploit moments when social oversight was minimal. This ability to read communities as carefully as he read individuals contributed directly to his success in avoiding detection while committing repeated murders over years. Little's hunting ground was not random. It was carefully curated, combining an intimate understanding of human behavior with tactical knowledge of urban landscapes. The process of victim selection within these hunting grounds was equally calculated. Little sought women whose circumstances made them particularly susceptible to manipulation, coercion, and control. These were individuals who might accept assistance or companionship from a stranger, who might comply with requests due to fear, fatigue, or prior trauma. Many of his victims were already navigating lives of instability, addiction, or social exclusion. Little's ability to identify these vulnerabilities was not merely instinctive. It was the result of decades of observation and experience. Each interaction with a potential victim was a careful assessment, a moment in which he evaluated risk, opportunity, and the likelihood of compliance. The mobility he maintained between cities further reinforced his ability to operate undetected. Little moved fluidly from state to state, city to city, a pattern that not only diversified his hunting grounds, but also complicated the ability of law enforcement to connect his crimes. In the pre-digital era of the 1980s and early 1990s, communication between jurisdictions was limited, and missing persons investigations were often siloed within local departments. Little intuitively exploited these gaps, ensuring that his crimes remained isolated and unconnected. Each new city was a blank slate, a place where his patterns could be repeated without the burden of prior suspicion or investigation. That Little's interactions with his victims were carefully calibrated. He understood the balance between charm, deception, and intimidation, using subtle psychological manipulation to gain trust and isolate women from potential witnesses. He could present himself as familiar or non-threatening, creating an environment in which his victims would let down their guard. Once isolated, he employed the method of control that had become his hallmark: strangulation. This combination of psychological manipulation and physical domination reflected both his compulsive need for control and his strategic approach to reducing risk. In addition to urban landscapes, Little also exploited transient and marginalized spaces such as shelters, motels, and abandoned buildings. These environments provided both opportunity and concealment, allowing him to execute murders with minimal exposure. He understood that victims who frequented these spaces were often overlooked by society and law enforcement, a reality that he used to his advantage. Each location became a calculated choice, demonstrating a chilling awareness of social oversight and human behavior. The hunting grounds of Samuel Little also reveal a predator attuned to the rhythms of society. He knew when streets would be empty, when residents would be distracted, and when law enforcement presence was minimal. This acute awareness of environment allowed him to plan encounters with precision, minimizing risk while maximizing opportunity. It also illustrates his long-term strategy. By understanding communities, he could operate repeatedly in different locations, adjusting his methods to the dynamics of each space. By the mid-1980s, the pattern was clear. Little had developed a methodology that combined urban and marginalized spaces, strategic mobility, and precise victim selection. He had created a map of opportunity in which his hunting grounds were carefully chosen, his targets carefully assessed, and his methods carefully executed. Each city became a stage, each community a canvas upon which he could enact his compulsion, and each victim a reflection of his tactical mastery. Understanding the intersection of location, community, and victim selection is critical to comprehending Samuel Little's longevity as a serial killer. His ability to adapt to environments, exploit social vulnerabilities, and operate across multiple jurisdictions ensured that he could sustain a decades-long killing spree. The cities and communities he chose were not incidental. They were carefully selected hunting grounds, each one facilitating a pattern of predation that would eventually make him America's most prolific serial killer. Samuel Little's predation was inseparable from his acute understanding of environment and social dynamics. By the late 1980s, he had not only perfected his methods of murder, but also honed his ability to navigate and exploit the communities he entered. Each city he visited, each neighborhood he explored, became part of a mental map of opportunity, a carefully evaluated landscape where potential victims could be found, approached, and ultimately controlled. This ability to interpret and manipulate environments was central to his long-term survival and prolific killing record. His interactions within communities demonstrated a level of psychological sophistication uncommon even among serial killers. Little was able to observe, predict, and influence human behavior with chilling accuracy. He could recognize moments when a woman was isolated, distracted, or receptive to interaction. He understood patterns of fear, hesitation, and compliance, and he used them to manipulate victims into vulnerable positions. In essence, he had become not just a predator, but a social tactician, able to exploit the intricacies of human interaction as effectively as he exploited gaps in law enforcement oversight. Shelters, transient housing, motels, and abandoned buildings became recurring elements of his hunting grounds. These were spaces frequented by individuals who were often marginalized and overlooked, providing both access and concealment. Little understood that women navigating these spaces were not only physically vulnerable, but also socially invisible, making them less likely to trigger immediate investigation if they disappeared. Each location he selected was chosen with deliberation, offering both the tactical advantage of isolation and the strategic benefit of societal neglect. The consistency with which he targeted such spaces reflects both his methodical nature and his deep awareness of social vulnerabilities that Little's mobility was equally crucial to his predatory strategy. By moving between cities and states, he diversified both his hunting grounds and the challenges faced by law enforcement. In a pre-digital era, communication between police departments was limited, and missing persons reports were often siloed, preventing the easy connection of cases across jurisdictions. Little intuitively exploited these weaknesses, understanding that his victims could disappear in one city and be forgotten or misclassified in another. His ability to operate across this fragmented landscape allowed him to commit repeated murders without drawing consistent scrutiny, creating a dispersed network of killings that would only be fully recognized decades later. Within these environments, Little exhibited a terrifying blend of compulsion and strategy. While he was driven by an irresistible urge to kill, each murder was executed with forethought. He carefully considered timing, location, and method, ensuring that each act satisfied both his psychological needs and his operational objectives. His preference for strangulation remained consistent, serving as both a means of control and a method that reduced forensic risk. The combination of compulsion, observation, and strategic planning allowed him to maintain a long-term killing spree that spanned decades, cities, and states. The communities and cities in which he operated also reveal a calculated understanding of societal blind spots. Little targeted marginalized populations who were often ignored or deprioritized by law enforcement. Women involved in sex work, battling addiction, or living transient lives were disproportionately represented among his victims. By focusing on these populations, he was able to exploit both social and institutional neglect, committing murders with minimal risk of detection. His predation was therefore both opportunistic and strategic, reflecting an understanding of systemic vulnerabilities as well as human behavior that Little's ability to adapt to each new environment further enhanced his efficacy. He observed neighborhood routines, identified areas of low visibility, and gauged the likely presence or absence of witnesses. Each encounter with a potential victim was approached with calculated patience, a careful assessment of risk, and a nuanced understanding of social interaction. This adaptability allowed him to refine his methods continuously, making him a predator whose tactics were both consistent in pattern and flexible in execution. Psychologically, the selection of hunting grounds and victims underscores Little's mastery of compartmentalization. He could move seamlessly between public spaces and private acts of violence, isolating his predatory behavior from social expectations, moral considerations, and potential consequences. The communities he targeted, often spaces where marginalized individuals lived or sought refuge, became both a playground and a shield. He exploited social invisibility, turning it into a tool that enabled repeated acts of violence without immediate repercussions. Over time, these hunting grounds became a critical element in understanding the scale and scope of his crimes. By analyzing cities, neighborhoods, and social spaces he frequented, investigators later were able to map patterns of predation, connecting disparate murders and uncovering the full extent of his killing spree. Each community represented both a stage and a shield, a place where he could exercise compulsion, assert control, and evade detection. Through these environments, Samuel Little's ability to combine mobility, observation, and strategic predation was fully realized by the end of this period. It was clear that Samuel Little's hunting grounds were as much a part of his methodology as the victims themselves. His meticulous selection of cities, neighborhoods, and transient spaces, combined with his understanding of societal blind spots, allowed him to operate across the country with unparalleled efficacy. The interplay between location, victim selection, and operational strategy highlights the terrifying sophistication of his predatory behavior, providing insight into how one man could claim the lives of 93 confirmed victims while remaining largely undetected for decades. Chapter 7: Shadows and Silence. How victims were overlooked. By the late 1980s, the magnitude of Samuel Little's killings was staggering, yet for decades, the majority of his victims remained invisible to society. Their disappearances often went unnoticed or were misclassified, leaving gaps in law enforcement records that Little exploited with terrifying efficiency. Understanding how and why these women were overlooked is crucial to grasping both the scale of his crimes and the societal context that allowed a serial killer to operate undetected across the United States. Many of Little's victims were women whose lives were already marginalized by poverty, addiction, or transient lifestyles. Society had largely rendered them invisible, and law enforcement frequently treated their disappearances as routine or low priority. Women who were involved in sex work, battling substance abuse, or living without stable housing often lacked advocates who could insist on investigations or sustained follow-up. In these circumstances, Little could commit murder after murder, confident that the absence of immediate inquiry would shield him from scrutiny. The systemic neglect of vulnerable populations effectively provided him with both opportunity and protection, a reality he understood instinctively. This invisibility was compounded by fragmented communication between police jurisdictions. In the pre-digital era, missing persons reports were often confined to local departments, and there was minimal information sharing across city or state lines. A woman who disappeared in one city might be recorded as missing locally, but the next town would have no knowledge of her absence. Little's mobility, moving from state to state and city to city, exploited this systemic weakness. Each relocation offered a fresh hunting ground, effectively resetting patterns of investigation and minimizing the chance that connections would be made between crimes. That Little's ability to operate undetected also reflects his understanding of public perception and social bias. Many of his victims were women who society, for various reasons, was quick to judge or dismiss. Their lifestyles, struggles, or appearances often led authorities and the public alike to assume voluntary disappearance or personal choice, rather than foul play. Little's predation capitalized on these prejudices, ensuring that his actions could continue largely unchallenged. By targeting women whom the system already ignored, he manipulated societal assumptions as effectively as he manipulated his victims. The psychology of why victims were overlooked is intertwined with institutional and societal failures. Law enforcement agencies, constrained by resources and operating under the biases of the time, often focused on cases deemed higher priority, those involving children, wealthy individuals, or violent public crimes. Women who fell outside these categories, particularly adults who were socially marginalized, were frequently deprioritized. Little's keen observation of these systemic tendencies allowed him to commit repeated murders in the shadows, confident that the victim's invisibility would serve as his shield. Each overlooked victim represents more than just a statistical gap. It reflects the intersection of societal neglect and the meticulous predation of a calculating killer. Little himself understood the practical benefits of this invisibility. In interviews years later, he described selecting victims based not only on personal vulnerability, but also on their social context. Women whose disappearance was unlikely to attract immediate investigation or sustained attention. This approach illustrates the combination of compulsion and strategy that defined his killings. He was not merely acting on desire. He was making tactical choices based on a sophisticated understanding of systemic and societal limitations. The failure to recognize or prioritize these disappearances also contributed to the longevity of Little's killing spree. For decades, he moved freely from city to city, committing murder after murder while leaving law enforcement baffled by the absence of clear patterns. The very invisibility of his victims, an outcome of both societal marginalization and systemic oversight, enabled a level of continuity in predation that few serial killers achieve. Each murder reinforced the feasibility of the next, creating a self-perpetuating cycle in which the system's blind spots became tools of survival and opportunity. That Little's exploitation of these societal gaps is a testament to both his intelligence and his predatory acumen. He operated with an understanding that law enforcement would often overlook marginalized victims and that social biases could obscure the reality of violent crime. His killings were therefore a combination of psychological compulsion and strategic advantage, carried out in spaces where society's neglect created the perfect cover. In this sense, the shadows and silences surrounding his victims were as much an enabler of crime as his personal cunning and mobility. That it is also important to recognize the human cost of this neglect. The women who fell victim to Little were not merely statistics. They were individuals whose lives, struggles, and humanity were erased by both violence and societal indifference. Each overlooked case represents a life terminated in obscurity, a story left untold, and a pattern that would take decades to reconstruct. Understanding how victims were ignored and why is essential to comprehending both the breadth of Little's crimes and the systemic vulnerabilities he exploited so effectively. The combination of societal neglect, institutional fragmentation, and personal predation created a perfect storm in which Samuel Little could operate unimpeded. The shadows in which he thrived were not only geographic but also social, existing in spaces where marginalized women were rendered invisible. By analyzing these patterns, investigators could begin to see the connections, identify recurring vulnerabilities, and, decades later, reconstruct the true scale of his devastating impact. These overlooked victims, once invisible, ultimately became the key to understanding and documenting the terrifying scope of America's most prolific serial killer. The systemic neglect that allowed Samuel Little's victims to remain invisible also provides a sobering insight into societal priorities and law enforcement practices during the latter half of the 20th century. Many of his victims lived on the margins of society, struggling with issues that rendered them vulnerable and socially invisible. Homelessness, substance abuse, economic instability, and involvement in sex work were factors that often led authorities to deprioritize their disappearances. In Little's mind, these vulnerabilities were opportunities, moments when a life could be taken with minimal interference and maximum concealment, that Little's understanding of law enforcement gaps was as precise as his understanding of human behavior. He knew that fragmented jurisdictional authority, poor interdepartmental communication, and the lack of centralized databases for missing persons created blind spots. A woman who vanished in one city would rarely be immediately connected to disappearances in another, especially if they were separated by state lines. Little capitalized on this fractured system, moving fluidly from city to city, ensuring that each new victim could be isolated in both space and systemic attention. His mobility and knowledge of law enforcement limitations turned geographic and bureaucratic gaps into effective tools of survival and predation. The social invisibility of his victims was another critical factor. Many were women whose lives were burdened with stigma, marginalization, or social isolation. Society often assumed their absences were voluntary, attributing disappearance to personal choice or transient lifestyle rather than foul play. Little understood these biases intuitively and relied upon them. By targeting women whom the system had already implicitly disregarded, he ensured that his crimes would continue largely unnoticed. The intersection of societal prejudice, law enforcement gaps, and individual predation created an environment uniquely conducive to sustained serial killing. This invisibility was further compounded by the era's limitations in communication and data management. Before the advent of national databases and digital record-keeping, police departments often worked in isolation. Missing persons reports were local, investigations were siloed, and connections across state lines were rarely made. Little's movement between jurisdictions effectively reset suspicion each time he arrived in a new location. By exploiting these systemic weaknesses, he was able to extend his predatory career for decades, striking in cities across the United States with minimal risk of detection. Each act reinforced the feasibility of the next, creating a sustained pattern of murder that spanned decades. Psychologically, Little's selection of overlooked victims highlights the interplay between compulsion and strategy. His urges to kill were genuine and uncontrollable, yet he paired these urges with a calculated awareness of opportunity and risk. The selection of socially marginalized women allowed him to satisfy his compulsion while simultaneously reducing the chance of immediate consequences. This balance of psychological drive and tactical consideration became a defining characteristic of his criminal behavior, enabling him to sustain one of the longest and most prolific serial killing sprees in history. The consequences of these patterns were devastating. Each overlooked disappearance not only represented a lost life, but also an opportunity for Little to continue without interruption. Investigators lacked the systemic tools, resources, and social frameworks to connect cases effectively, and marginalized communities lacked the social power to demand thorough investigations. Little's crimes thrived in these gaps, and for decades, the scale of his predation remained obscured. The women he killed were effectively erased from public consciousness, their lives rendered invisible both before and after their murders. Little himself reflected on this invisibility in later interviews, revealing a disturbing awareness of both human and institutional weaknesses. He described choosing victims not only based on physical vulnerability, but also on the likelihood that they would be ignored if they disappeared. This insight demonstrates the chilling intelligence that underpinned his predation. While driven by compulsion, he applied strategic thinking, using societal neglect and law enforcement limitations as tools to facilitate repeated killings without detection. In this sense, his crimes were not only acts of personal violence, but also calculated manipulations of systemic and social vulnerabilities. The decades-long evasion of justice highlights the devastating interplay between personal predation and systemic inadequacy. Little's ability to operate undetected across multiple states underscores both the sophistication of his methods and the societal blind spots that enabled them. Each overlooked victim was a testament to both his cunning and the failures of the systems tasked with protecting the most vulnerable. The shadows in which he operated were not solely geographic. They were social, institutional, and psychological, reflecting a world that had underestimated the danger posed by an intelligent and highly mobile predator. By the time his killings began to be connected decades later, the scale of Samuel Little's crimes became apparent. The overlooked victims, once invisible, became the key to understanding his unprecedented pattern of predation. Their lives, and the societal conditions that rendered them invisible, were critical in mapping the full extent of his killing spree. Each case illuminated how intelligence, mobility, psychological manipulation, and societal neglect converged to create a near-perfect storm for one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The lessons of these shadows and silences are both grim and essential. They reveal not only the capabilities of Samuel Little as a predator, but also the vulnerabilities within society and institutions that allowed his crimes to continue unchecked. Understanding these dynamics provides critical insight into both the mechanics of serial predation and the systemic changes necessary to prevent similar tragedies. It is within this context of invisibility, neglect, and predation that the true horror of Samuel Little's life's work becomes fully apparent, revealing the scale of his crimes and the depth of societal complicity in rendering his victims unseen. Chapter 8: Confessions Behind Bars, Interrogations, and Uncovering the Truth. By the time Samuel Little was apprehended in 2012, decades of murder had passed largely unconnected, leaving law enforcement and society with a puzzle of unimaginable scale. Little's capture marked the beginning of an unprecedented process of confession and reconstruction, as investigators sought to unravel the complex web of killings he had left in his wake. These confessions, provided in chilling detail, offered a rare window into the mind of America's most prolific serial killer, revealing not only the extent of his crimes, but also the methods, motivations, and psychological patterns that had enabled him to evade detection for decades. From the outset, Little's approach to confession was both methodical and compelling. Unlike many killers who resist admitting guilt or minimize their actions, Little voluntarily and consistently disclosed his crimes, providing detailed accounts of victims, locations, and methods. Investigators quickly realized that these confessions were not exaggerations or attempts at notoriety. They were accurate and verifiable statements that, when cross-referenced with unsolved cases, aligned with missing persons reports, crime scene details, and witness accounts. Each confession represented a meticulous recounting of decades of predation, offering a roadmap to crimes previously hidden in shadows. One striking aspect of Little's confessions was the precision with which he identified victims. He was able to describe physical characteristics, personal details, and circumstances surrounding the murders with a specificity that lent credibility to his claims. Investigators were initially cautious, aware that memory can be unreliable over decades. But as confessions were verified, it became clear that Little possessed an extraordinary capacity for recollection. This accuracy provided both closure for families and the ability to reconstruct timelines and locations across multiple states, illuminating the scope of his killing spree in a way that few serial killer confessions ever have. The psychological dimensions of these confessions are equally compelling. Little recounted his actions with a calm and matter-of-fact demeanor, often detailing the steps of abduction, manipulation, and strangulation with the same clinical detachment he had demonstrated during his crimes. This detachment underscores the psychopathy evident throughout his life, a lack of remorse, an absence of empathy, and a consistent focus on control and compulsion. Yet, paradoxically, these confessions also revealed an underlying desire for acknowledgement, a need for the truth of his actions to be recognized, if not by society, then by those who documented them. The act of confession became a complex interplay between compulsion, ego, and the procedural demands of justice that Little's confessions were aided by the investigative methods employed by modern law enforcement. Technological advancements, centralized databases, and improved interjurisdictional communication allowed detectives to cross-reference his accounts with historical records. Through careful interviews, sketches, and corroboration with unsolved missing persons cases, law enforcement could verify each claim with increasing certainty. This combination of killer cooperation and investigative rigor produced a uniquely complete picture of a criminal career that spanned decades, providing insight into both operational patterns and psychological motivations. The confessions also shed light on Little's mobility and hunting patterns. He detailed the cities he traveled to, the types of neighborhoods he favored, and the situational opportunities that guided his selection of victims. Each account provided a chronological and geographic map of predation, offering insight into the interplay between personal compulsion, environmental awareness, and strategic movement. The confessions revealed a predator who had not acted impulsively in isolation, but had engaged in calculated, deliberate acts of violence, exploiting both systemic gaps and social neglect with chilling efficiency. But a critical component of these confessions was the identification of victim characteristics. Little consistently targeted women who were socially marginalized, transient, or involved in sex work. He described choosing victims who were less likely to attract attention if they disappeared, highlighting the intersection between psychological compulsion and strategic awareness. By voluntarily revealing these details, he provided investigators with a comprehensive understanding of his modus operandi, patterns, and methods, information that had eluded law enforcement for decades. The process of confession also revealed Little's understanding of temporal and spatial patterns in law enforcement. He knew that moving between states and cities would reduce the likelihood of his murders being connected, a fact he openly acknowledged during interviews. These admissions provide critical insight into the sophisticated strategies employed by a serial killer who combined intelligence, psychological insight, and practical awareness to sustain a decades-long spree. Each confession served not only as an admission of guilt, but as a blueprint of a career in predation, illustrating the chilling intersection of compulsion, calculation, and opportunity. Importantly, the confessions had a profound impact on victims' families. For decades, many families had remained uncertain about the fate of their loved ones, plagued by the ambiguity of disappearance and loss. Little's detailed accounts provided verification, closure, and an understanding of the circumstances surrounding death. While nothing could undo the tragedy of the murders, these confessions represented a critical step in acknowledging both the victims and the unprecedented scale of the crimes, giving voice to lives that had been silenced. Samuel Little's confessions behind bars marked a turning point in the investigation of his crimes. They offered a meticulous, verifiable, and psychologically revealing account of a criminal career that spanned decades, multiple states, and nearly 100 victims. By openly recounting his actions, Little not only illuminated his own modus operandi and mobility, but also exposed systemic vulnerabilities that had allowed his crimes to remain largely undetected for decades. These confessions became an invaluable tool for law enforcement historians, and criminologists seeking to understand the full scope of America's most prolific serial killer. The confessions of Samuel Little continued to unravel the full scope of his crimes, revealing patterns, locations, and timelines that had previously eluded law enforcement for decades. Each revelation was more than an admission of guilt. It was a detailed map of predation, showing how he had maneuvered through cities, communities, and social systems with calculated precision. In interviews, he often recounted encounters with his victims with startling specificity, describing physical attributes, clothing, and the circumstances of their deaths. These accounts were corroborated by historical missing persons reports, enabling law enforcement to confirm cases that had long been considered cold or unsolvable. That Little's ability to remember such minute details decades after the crime speaks to the unique interplay between obsession and memory. For him, the act of killing was a highly memorable, ritualized event. Each encounter, each methodical act, and each decision left an indelible imprint, enabling him to recount events with accuracy when prompted. This exceptional recall transformed confessions from mere verbal admissions into verifiable investigative tools, allowing authorities to finally connect cases scattered across state lines and time. His confessions effectively bridged gaps in decades-old investigations, providing clarity where uncertainty had once dominated. During the interrogation process, Little often revealed insights into his own psychology. He described his urges to kill as irresistible, portraying himself as compelled by forces beyond conscious control. Yet, simultaneously, he acknowledged the strategic and calculated nature of his crimes. He chose his victims, assessed the environment, and executed murders with an understanding of risk and consequence. This duality, compulsion tempered by methodical planning, underscores the chilling complexity of his criminal mind. He was both a man driven by psychological need and a predator guided by intelligence and experience. Law enforcement soon recognized that Little's confessions could not merely be accepted at face value. They required verification. Investigators meticulously cross-referenced his accounts with missing persons cases, crime reports, and witness statements. Each confirmed detail reinforced the credibility of subsequent confessions, creating a cascading effect in which more and more victims were identified. This methodical verification transformed Little's oral admissions into a forensic roadmap, allowing authorities to reconstruct decades of criminal activity and understand patterns that had previously been invisible. One of the most disturbing revelations from these confessions was the sheer geographic spread of his crimes. Little had operated in multiple states, moving fluidly from city to city, preying on women whose disappearances often went uninvestigated. By exploiting jurisdictional boundaries and societal blind spots, he created a network of murder that law enforcement was ill-equipped to recognize. His confessions illuminated not only the scope of his predation, but also the weaknesses in systemic communication, highlighting how a highly mobile and intelligent killer could evade capture for decades. The confessions also shed light on the social dynamics that facilitated his predation. Many of his victims were socially marginalized, struggling with addiction, poverty, or transient lifestyles. Little explicitly targeted women who were less likely to be noticed if they disappeared, demonstrating an awareness of social and institutional neglect. His admissions revealed the calculated selection of victims based on vulnerability, a strategy that combined psychological compulsion with tactical foresight. The intersection of social invisibility and criminal opportunity became a central theme in understanding both the scale of his crimes and the systemic failures that allowed them to persist. That Little's cooperation in revealing the truth was unprecedented. Unlike many serial killers, he engaged with investigators over multiple sessions, providing detailed narratives that included locations, methods, and even sketches of his victims. These sketches, drawn from memory, often corresponded with actual missing persons and provided visual confirmation of identity. The combination of verbal, behavioral, and visual recollection offered an unparalleled insight into the mind of a serial killer, blending psychological analysis with forensic verification. Each confession became a tool for piecing together the fragmented history of his crimes, allowing families and law enforcement alike to achieve clarity and closure. The confessions also allowed for the identification of patterns in his modus operandi. Repeated behaviors, victim selection criteria, and methods of killing became clearer as more cases were verified. Investigators could trace the evolution of his methods, noting both consistencies and adaptations over time. This understanding provided a rare opportunity to study not only the actions of a prolific serial killer, but also the psychological and environmental factors that shaped his behavior. Little's confessions thus became an invaluable resource for criminology, psychology, and law enforcement practices. Ultimately, the confessions behind bars transformed the understanding of Samuel Little's criminal career. What had once been a series of isolated disappearances became a coherent narrative of calculated, multi-decade predation. Through his admissions, investigators could finally map the staggering breadth of his crimes, understand the systemic vulnerabilities he exploited, and document the consistent psychological and operational patterns that defined his actions. These confessions illuminated the terrifying efficiency of one of the most prolific serial killers in history, providing insight, closure, and a chilling record of human predation that would shape investigative approaches for years to come. Chapter 9: Faces from Memory, Sketches, Identification, and Cold Cases. One of the most extraordinary aspects of Samuel Little's confessions was his ability to recall and describe his victims in remarkable detail, decades after their deaths. In collaboration with law enforcement, Little produced hand-drawn sketches of women he had murdered, many of whom had remained unidentified or considered missing for years. These sketches became instrumental in connecting his confessions to cold cases, transforming previously unsolvable mysteries into documented tragedies and offering families long-awaited closure. The sketches not only captured physical likeness, but also served as a testament to the meticulous way in which Little remembered each victim, a chilling reflection of his obsessive and calculating mind that Little's artistic depictions were often strikingly accurate. He could reproduce facial features, hairstyles, and distinguishing marks with astonishing precision, despite the passage of decades. Investigators compared these sketches with photographs of missing women, sometimes recognizing them instantly, other times uncovering previously unreported disappearances. These drawings were more than just images. They were forensic tools bridging memory and reality, a visual key that unlocked connections between Little's confessions and real-world evidence. Each sketch also revealed an unnerving intimacy, as if the act of drawing allowed him to relive the encounter and assert a final claim over his victims, even years later. The use of sketches as an investigative method marked a breakthrough in connecting Little to unsolved cases. Traditional investigative techniques, reliant on reports, photographs, or witness statements, had proven insufficient to identify many of his victims. Little's memory, translated into sketches, created a new pathway for identification. Law enforcement agencies across the country collaborated to circulate these images, seeking matches with missing persons databases, old newspaper articles, and community records. The sketches, sometimes rough yet remarkably precise, became crucial in verifying the scale of his crimes and linking disparate cases across states and decades. These artistic confessions also highlighted the interplay between psychological compulsion and operational memory. Samuel Little's ability to recall minute details of victims' appearances, clothing, and circumstances of death points to a mind deeply attuned to observation and memorization. For him, the act of killing was highly ritualized. Each encounter was stored with exceptional clarity. The sketches demonstrate that this memory was not only preserved, but could be externalized in a form that allowed law enforcement to verify and corroborate historical cases. This unusual combination of psychopathy and mnemonic skill made Little's confessions uniquely valuable, providing insights rarely attainable in cases involving long-term serial killers. The identification process through sketches often involved painstaking cross-referencing with cold cases. Investigators worked tirelessly to compare Little's drawings with missing persons reports, looking for visual matches and corroborating details such as age, height, weight, tattoos, and last known locations. In many instances, these efforts led to the resolution of cases long considered unsolvable. Families who had waited decades without answers finally received confirmation of their loved one's fate, bringing both closure and heartbreak. The sketches became a bridge across time, connecting the crimes of the past to the investigative realities of the present. Each confirmed victim also allowed investigators to better understand Little's patterns and operational behavior. By linking sketches to actual individuals, authorities could reconstruct timelines, travel routes, and methods of predation. These connections illuminated the scope of his killings, showing not only his geographic mobility, but also the consistency of his modus operandi. Patterns emerged in the types of women targeted, locations chosen, and methods employed, painting a comprehensive portrait of one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The use of sketches also underscored the limitations of traditional investigative practices, particularly regarding marginalized victims. Many of Little's victims had been socially invisible, their disappearances either unreported or dismissed due to their circumstances. Without photographs or formal records, investigators had little to go on. Little's sketches, drawn from memory, bypassed these limitations, allowing visual representation to supplement incomplete or non-existent official documentation. They transformed memory into evidence, bridging gaps created by both systemic oversight and societal neglect. Beyond their investigative value, the sketches served as a window into the mind of the killer. They revealed the ways in which Little internalized and cataloged each victim, combining psychological fixation with precise observational skill. The act of sketching was not mere artistry. It was a reenactment and affirmation of his crimes, a process through which he could reassert control and memory over those he had killed. These images stand as both evidence and psychological testimony, reflecting the disturbing intimacy with which Little approached each act of murder. The collaboration between Samuel Little and law enforcement in producing and verifying these sketches represents a remarkable convergence of memory, art, and forensic investigation. It allowed decades-old mysteries to be solved, victims to be named, and patterns of predation to be systematically documented. Each image, each identification, contributes not only to the record of Little's crimes, but also to a broader understanding of how serial killers operate, remember, and interact with their environments and victims. Ultimately, the sketches and identification process highlight the importance of persistence, interdisciplinary collaboration, and the value of unconventional investigative tools. They reveal how one man's extraordinary memory and confessions could be transformed into verifiable evidence. solving cold cases that had confounded investigators for decades. In the end, these faces from memory became a critical key to understanding Samuel Little's unprecedented killing spree, giving voice to victims who had been silenced, and offering an extraordinary insight into the mind of a serial killer who operated in the shadows for more than 40 years. As the investigation into Samuel Little's confessions progressed, the sketches he produced became increasingly central to uncovering the magnitude of his crimes. Each drawing was cross-referenced with missing persons reports, old photographs, and witness recollections, gradually forming a mosaic of decades-long predation. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states coordinated efforts, comparing the images with cold case files and community records, sometimes discovering matches that had been lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of years gone by. In many cases, families who had spent decades in limbo finally received confirmation of their loved one's fate, a grim yet necessary revelation that highlighted both the human cost of neglect and the extraordinary reach of Little's killing spree. The process of identification through sketches was meticulous and often emotionally charged. Investigators had to balance the need for verification with sensitivity toward families awaiting answers. Each potential match required careful confirmation. Age, location, circumstances of disappearance, and unique physical features all had to align with Little's recollection. In some instances, the sketches provided the first tangible lead in cases that had long been considered unsolvable. The combination of memory, artistic skill, and investigative persistence allowed authorities to reconstruct a pattern of murder that spanned decades, geographic boundaries, and social strata, demonstrating the profound value of Little's cooperation. These sketches also shed light on the evolution of Little's modus operandi. By comparing images associated with confirmed victims, investigators could discern both consistencies and adaptations in his methods. Certain elements, such as his choice of vulnerable women, the use of strangulation, and the exploitation of marginalized spaces, remained consistent. Yet other factors, such as the selection of specific neighborhoods, approaches to interaction, and methods of concealment, varied depending on time, location, and opportunity. The sketches became a tool not only for identification but also for behavioral analysis, revealing the interplay between compulsion, strategy, and environmental adaptation in his predatory patterns. Furthermore, the sketches highlighted the tragic reality of systemic neglect. Many of Little's victims had been invisible to authorities and society alike, and the process of matching images to names often brought to light the failures of prior investigations. Women who had disappeared while navigating precarious lives, struggling with addiction, homelessness, or marginalization, were disproportionately represented among his victims. The sketches thus served a dual purpose: identifying individuals while also exposing the social and institutional vulnerabilities that had allowed their murders to remain undetected for decades. This intersection of forensic artistry and social commentary deepened the understanding of both the killer's methods and the societal context that enabled his predation. AS investigators worked to corroborate Little's drawings. A pattern of mobility emerged. His crimes spanned multiple states, with clusters of victims in urban centers, transient neighborhoods, and marginalized communities. By mapping the locations of confirmed sketches, law enforcement was able to reconstruct his travel patterns, providing insight into how he chose hunting grounds and navigated social and geographic landscapes. This mapping, enabled by the accuracy and consistency of his sketches, allowed authorities to not only identify victims but also anticipate potential undiscovered cases. Each sketch became both a revelation and a roadmap, illuminating a decades-long journey of violence that had previously been shrouded in anonymity. The collaboration between Little and law enforcement in producing and verifying these sketches is unprecedented in modern criminology. Rarely does a serial killer provide such detailed, accurate, and cooperative insight into decades of murders. These efforts required patience, meticulous verification, and the careful integration of historical records, forensic evidence, and personal recollections. The result, however, was extraordinary, a comprehensive catalog of victims and patterns that revealed the full scale of one man's horrific predation and offered closure to families and communities long denied the truth. Beyond their investigative utility, the sketches offer psychological insight into the mind of Samuel Little. They reflect his ability to observe, internalize, and recall minute details of human appearance and behavior. Each drawing captures not just a likeness, but an imprint of a moment in time, an encounter that left an indelible mark on his memory. The act of sketching also served as a form of engagement with the crimes, allowing him to relive experiences and reaffirm control in a controlled environment. Through these images, investigators gained unprecedented access to the cognitive and emotional processes underpinning his actions, providing a rare window into a serial killer's internal world that in the end, the faces from memory, the sketches, were far more than mere illustrations. They became keys to unlocking the complex and widespread network of Samuel Little's crimes, turning decades of uncertainty into verified records of predation. They enabled law enforcement to identify, document, and analyze nearly 100 victims, while also offering a measure of closure for families left in decades-long suspense. Each sketch stands as both evidence and testimony, a bridge between the horrors of the past and the investigative rigor of the present. In revealing the faces of his victims, Little inadvertently provided society with a profound understanding of the scale, methodology, and psychological depth of his crimes, solidifying his place as America's most prolific serial killer and illuminating the chilling intersections of memory, predation, and societal oversight. Chapter 10: Patterns of Predation. Understanding the method and modus operandi. The staggering number of Samuel Little's confirmed victims, 93 and counting, has made him the most prolific serial killer in modern American history. Yet beyond the number lies a methodical pattern, a carefully honed modus operandi that allowed him to operate across decades, states, and communities with minimal detection. Understanding these patterns is essential to comprehending how one man could commit such a vast array of murders while leaving law enforcement for decades with few leads. Little's method reflects a chilling blend of compulsion, observation, and strategic calculation, making him a uniquely instructive figure in the study of serial predation. Little's approach to victim selection demonstrates the intersection of psychology and opportunity. He targeted women who were socially marginalized, transient, or otherwise overlooked by society. Many struggled with addiction, economic instability, or lived on the fringes of urban life. Little's selection process was deliberate. He sought victims whose absence would attract little attention and who could be isolated without drawing public scrutiny. By focusing on vulnerable populations, he minimized risk while satisfying his compulsions, showing both predatory intelligence and an unsettling awareness of systemic neglect. The method of attack remained consistent across decades, revealing both compulsion and tactical reasoning. Strangulation was his preferred method of murder, chosen for its combination of control, efficiency, and low risk of detection. By relying on a method that left minimal physical evidence compared to firearms or stabbing, Little ensured that his killings would often be classified as undetermined or unexplained, further obscuring patterns and reducing the likelihood of immediate investigation. This choice of method reflects a sophisticated understanding of both human anatomy and forensic vulnerability, underscoring the calculated aspect of his predatory behavior. Mobility was a critical component of his modus operandi. Little traveled extensively across the United States, exploiting gaps in law enforcement communication and jurisdictional limitations. In an era before national databases and digital record keeping, missing persons reports were often confined to local departments, creating blind spots he could exploit. By moving from city to city, he effectively reset suspicion with each relocation, allowing patterns to repeat without drawing consistent attention. His geographic spread was not random. It followed a strategy designed to maximize opportunity while minimizing exposure, demonstrating a disturbing blend of instinct and planning. Another hallmark of his predatory strategy was his ability to isolate victims. Little employed subtle psychological manipulation, using charm, deception, and coercion to gain trust. He could present himself as non-threatening, familiar, or sympathetic, creating situations in which victims would willingly comply with him. Once isolated, he could exert control efficiently and execute his compulsions with minimal risk. This combination of social skill and predatory aggression highlights a chilling understanding of human behavior, allowing him to navigate complex social landscapes with deadly precision. That Little's consistency in targeting certain types of women across decades also reveals an obsessive fixation. By examining patterns, investigators noted recurring themes in age, physical characteristics, and social context. These preferences were not merely coincidental. They reflected an ingrained psychological template that guided his selection and approach. The combination of long-term compulsion and strategic targeting allowed him to refine his methods over time, improving both efficiency and concealment while deepening the psychological imprint of his actions. The timeline of predation further illuminates his methodology. Over decades, Little committed murders with periods of intense activity interspersed with quieter intervals. These pauses were not necessarily due to deterrence, but often coincided with relocation or shifts in opportunity. By observing environmental and social conditions, he adjusted his behavior, striking when circumstances were optimal and avoiding situations that might attract attention. This adaptive approach underscores his ability to merge compulsion with practical strategy, ensuring continuity in his killing spree while remaining largely undetected. That Little's interaction with law enforcement and the wider public also illustrates the sophistication of his method. He understood how social biases, systemic neglect, and procedural limitations could be leveraged. By targeting marginalized women and exploiting jurisdictional gaps, he operated in a space where detection was unlikely and intervention minimal. This conscious exploitation of societal blind spots demonstrates a strategic mind operating in parallel with compulsive urges, creating a pattern of predation both psychologically driven and methodically executed. In addition to physical and behavioral patterns, Little left a psychological signature in his crimes. Each murder reflected his need for control, his compulsion to dominate, and his obsession with memory. Victims were not only physically overpowered but psychologically cataloged, leaving an indelible imprint on his memory that would later facilitate confessions, sketches, and detailed recollections decades later. The integration of compulsion, methodical planning, and psychological fixation defines the core of Little's modus operandi, providing insight into the mechanisms that allowed such sustained and widespread predation. By analyzing the patterns of predation in Samuel Little's killings, investigators and criminologists have been able to reconstruct the operational, psychological, and social components of his crimes. Each element, victim selection, method, mobility, isolation techniques, and exploitation of systemic gaps, reveals a calculated approach to serial murder that was both chilling and instructive. Understanding these patterns provides critical insight not only into Little's behavior, but also into the vulnerabilities of society and investigative systems that allowed a man to commit nearly 100 murders across decades without immediate detection. As investigators delved deeper into Samuel Little's crimes, the patterns of his predation became increasingly apparent, revealing a disturbing combination of compulsion, intelligence, and methodical planning. His modus operandi was not only consistent but also adaptable, allowing him to refine his methods in response to changes in environment, social circumstances, and law enforcement practices. The patterns uncovered during his confessions, sketches, and corroborations illustrate a uniquely complex criminal mind, one capable of sustaining decades of lethal activity across multiple states. But Little's killings were marked by the careful selection of vulnerable victims. Women who struggled with addiction, poverty, or homelessness were disproportionately represented among his victims. Their social invisibility was a key factor in his ability to operate undetected. He understood that these women were less likely to have advocates demanding investigation or to be prioritized by police. By consciously targeting socially marginalized individuals, Little ensured that the consequences of his actions would be minimized, creating a dangerous overlap between human vulnerability and systemic neglect. The choice of victims was thus both a psychological and practical strategy, revealing an unsettling awareness of societal dynamics. Isolation was central to Little's predatory strategy. He possessed an uncanny ability to create circumstances in which victims were alone or willing to accompany him, often using charm, manipulation, and coercion. Once isolated, he could exercise total control, ensuring that the act of killing proceeded with minimal interference. This ability to manipulate social situations speaks to a deep understanding of human behavior, one that allowed him to exploit fear, trust, and compliance. Each act of predation was therefore both calculated and compulsive, demonstrating a balance between psychological drive and operational efficiency. Mobility was another crucial element of his modus operandi. Little traveled extensively, often across state lines, exploiting the fragmented nature of law enforcement jurisdiction. In an era before digital record-keeping and national databases, communication between police departments was limited, enabling him to commit murders in one city while avoiding detection in another. Each relocation provided a fresh hunting ground and minimized the likelihood of patterns being recognized. By understanding these systemic gaps, Little combined psychological compulsion with strategic foresight, creating an extended network of predation that law enforcement struggled to connect for decades. Temporal patterns also characterized his killings. While he did not adhere to a rigid schedule, bursts of activity were often followed by pauses. These intervals were influenced by factors such as relocation, opportunity, and environmental conditions, demonstrating his ability to adapt to circumstances. Unlike impulsive killers, Little's timing reflected situational awareness and planning. These temporal dynamics further reveal the sophistication of his approach, blending instinct, observation, and strategy to maximize the efficiency and sustainability of his crimes. That Little's method of killing, strangulation, remained remarkably consistent. Strangulation allowed him to exert control, minimize evidence, and execute murders quietly. This choice was not random. It reflected both practical and psychological considerations. By mastering a method that left minimal forensic traces, he reduced the risk of detection while also satisfying his compulsion for direct, intimate control over his victims. The repeated use of this technique across decades and multiple states created a recognizable behavioral signature, one that ultimately helped investigators link cases once confessions and sketches were analyzed. Psychologically, the pattern of predation reflects Little's obsessive cataloging of victims. Each murder was memorialized in his mind, allowing him to recall minute details decades later. This obsessive memory not only facilitated confessions, but also produced highly accurate sketches and victim descriptions. The interplay of memory, compulsion, and methodical observation distinguishes Little from many serial killers, highlighting a rare combination of psychopathy, intelligence, and systematic planning. Each murder left an indelible imprint, which he later used to guide law enforcement in identifying victims and reconstructing timelines. That Little's ability to exploit societal and systemic weaknesses further underscores the sophistication of his modus operandi. He operated in spaces where marginalized populations were ignored, relied on fragmented law enforcement systems, and leveraged social biases that minimized attention to his victims. By combining these structural insights with personal compulsion and methodical strategy, he created a long-running, high-volume pattern of predation that remained largely undetected for decades. This integration of environmental awareness, psychological understanding, and operational skill defines the uniqueness of his criminal career. Investigators studying Little's pattern of predation have noted the importance of behavioral consistency in confirming his confessions. Repeated elements, victim type, method of killing, geographic mobility, and social targeting provided a framework to connect disparate cases across decades. This allowed law enforcement to identify previously unsolved murders and recognize a coherent narrative in what had once appeared to be isolated incidents. By understanding these patterns, authorities were able to quantify the scope of his crimes, establish timelines, and confirm the identities of victims, transforming decades of fragmented investigations into a comprehensive picture of predation. Ultimately, the study of Samuel Little's patterns of predation provides insight not only into his mind, but also into the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed him to operate with impunity. By combining compulsion, calculated strategy, psychological manipulation, and mobility, he created a uniquely efficient and devastating approach to serial murder. Understanding these patterns is crucial to appreciating both the scale of his crimes and the mechanisms that allowed them to persist across decades, cities, and communities. It is through the lens of these behavioral patterns that law enforcement, criminologists, and society can fully grasp the extraordinary and chilling reality of America's most prolific serial killer. Chapter 11: Victims' Lives and Stories, Remembering the Forgotten. In the narrative of Samuel Little, it is all too easy to become absorbed in statistics, patterns, and confessions, to view the killer as the central figure. Yet behind each of the 93 confirmed murders lies a human story, a life interrupted, a family left waiting, a voice silenced. Chapter 11 seeks to return focus to the victims themselves, to explore who they were, how they lived, and why their stories mattered. By reconstructing their lives, law enforcement and historians have sought to restore identity and dignity to women who had been long overlooked, often erased by circumstance, social neglect, or systemic indifference. Many of Little's victims were young women navigating precarious lives. Poverty, substance abuse, and marginalization were recurring themes, yet these challenges did not define them entirely. Some were mothers, sisters, or daughters, struggling to provide stability in an unforgiving world. Others were students, part-time workers, or individuals with ambitions and aspirations that were tragically cut short. By reconstructing their lives, Investigators and advocates aim to move beyond the reduction of these women to mere victims, acknowledging their humanity, potential, and individuality. The diversity among the victims reflects the complex social landscape little exploited. While many were marginalized due to social or economic circumstances, others were transient, seeking opportunities in unfamiliar cities or environments. Some had connections to family or community, but lacked advocates willing or able to insist on investigation when they disappeared. These circumstances created a landscape in which a highly mobile predator could operate with near impunity. Yet within these challenges were stories of resilience, joy, and ordinary life, underscoring the profound tragedy of lives stolen in their prime. Family members often waited decades for news. The absence of confirmation about their loved ones' fates created a persistent liminality, a state of grief without resolution. For some, every unreturned call or unvisited apartment fueled anxiety and uncertainty. When Little's confessions began to emerge, families confronted a paradoxical mix of relief and horror. Relief came from finally knowing the truth. Horror from realizing the systematic and sustained violence inflicted on someone they loved. Each confession thus reverberated not only through historical records, but also through intimate spaces of grief, memory, and longing. The task of documenting these lives has been painstaking. Investigators and historians rely on photographs, interviews, court records, and community archives to reconstruct the stories of Little's victims. For many women, prior documentation was limited or incomplete, a reflection of both systemic oversight and social marginalization. As sketches and confessions are matched to missing persons reports, a portrait emerges of each individual, a young woman with a name, family, and life history, rather than a mere case number. This process transforms abstract statistics into narratives that command empathy, recognition, and remembrance. Each victim's story highlights not only the tragedy of her death, but also the social vulnerabilities that Little exploited. Understanding these circumstances provides critical insight into why some disappearances went unnoticed, why patterns remained undetected for decades, and how social neglect and marginalization can amplify the predatory reach of serial offenders. Many victims were invisible in life due to economic and social precarity, and tragically, that invisibility extended into death, obscuring the true scale of the crimes for decades. The lives of Little's victims were also marked by resilience, independence, and complexity. Some had survived difficult childhoods, struggled against addiction, or managed familial obligations while seeking personal fulfillment. Others had aspirations, hobbies, and relationships that enriched their communities in ways often unrecorded by official documents. By documenting these lives, historians and law enforcement ensure that the victims are remembered not merely as numbers, but as individuals who experienced love, struggle, joy, and loss, reinforcing their human identity amidst the horror of their murders that in many instances, Little himself provided details that humanized his victims beyond their physical descriptions. He could recall names, interactions, and personal quirks, providing insight into their individuality. While these recollections are unsettling, they also offer an important opportunity for investigators to restore the narrative of life rather than death. These details allow families, communities, and society at large to acknowledge the uniqueness of each victim and confront the devastating consequences of predation with a fuller understanding of the lives affected. The act of remembering also challenges societal tendencies to overlook marginalized individuals. By highlighting the stories, struggles, and resilience of Little's victims, society can begin to recognize the broader implications of social invisibility and neglect. Each story is a reminder that every human life holds significance and that failure to recognize and protect vulnerable populations can have catastrophic consequences. The victims' lives, when documented and celebrated, counteract decades of erasure and provide a lasting testament to the individuals whose voices were silenced. Through the painstaking process of recollection, documentation, and verification, a fuller picture emerges. These women are no longer anonymous faces in statistics or cold case files. They are human beings with histories, relationships, and identities that merit remembrance. Samuel Little's predation, though horrific in scale, is thus contextualized within the human tapestry of lives disrupted, families mourning, and communities grappling with loss. Recognizing the victims' stories restores agency and dignity to those whom society had too long failed to see, offering a crucial counterbalance to the narrative dominated by the killer himself. As the investigation into Samuel Little progressed, the effort to reconstruct his victims' lives became an essential component of understanding the full scope of his crimes. Each life reclaimed through confessions, sketches, and corroboration represents a story interrupted, a narrative cut short by violence, yet capable of being honored through memory. Law enforcement, historians, and advocates worked meticulously to restore identities, reconstruct timelines, and document the social, economic, and personal contexts in which these women lived. By examining these stories, the victims emerge not as abstract statistics, but as individuals whose lives were full of complexity, potential, and meaning. Some of Little's victims had endured hardship from early childhood, navigating unstable homes, poverty, or abuse. These formative challenges, while difficult, often fostered resilience, resourcefulness, and independence. Others had pursued education, part-time work, or creative endeavors, demonstrating ambition despite systemic obstacles. Even in the context of vulnerability, these women exhibited agency, community engagement, and personal dreams. By highlighting these aspects, researchers and law enforcement ensure that the narrative extends beyond victimhood, portraying individuals with identity, memory, and lived experience rather than mere targets of violence. Family members, often kept in agonizing suspense, began to experience both relief and sorrow as confessions matched their missing loved ones. Decades of unanswered questions were suddenly replaced with knowledge that brought painful closure, but also a form of justice and recognition of their loved one's existence. Each identification, corroborated through sketches, timelines, and investigative work, created an intersection of grief, validation, and societal acknowledgement. In these moments, families confronted the duality of human experience, the horror of the crime juxtaposed with the affirmation that their loved ones were finally being remembered. The social dynamics surrounding the victims' lives illuminate why Little's crimes remained largely undetected for so long. Many operated within transient communities, struggled with addiction, or lacked strong advocacy networks. In this context, disappearances often went unreported or uninvestigated. By targeting women whose lives were already marginalized, Little exploited systemic gaps in policing and social attention. The victims' stories, when examined, underscore the interplay between societal invisibility and vulnerability, revealing how structural neglect can amplify a predator's opportunity. This recognition is crucial not only for historical understanding, but also for shaping preventative strategies for future vulnerable populations. The individual narratives also provide profound insight into the ripple effects of violence. Friends, family, and community members were left navigating uncertainty and grief, often without information or recourse. Long-term emotional trauma became a secondary, pervasive consequence of each murder. Through confessions, sketches, and investigations, law enforcement began to bridge the gap, restoring fragments of identity and narrative to those left behind. The process of documenting these lives, while painful, is both restorative and vital to honoring the memory of the victims. Moreover, the stories reveal the complexity of human relationships in the context of marginalization. Many victims had networks of friends, coworkers, or neighbors who cared for them, even if these connections were limited. Their lives, while precarious, were entwined with others, demonstrating that social marginalization does not equate to social emptiness. Recognizing these relationships underscores the humanity of each individual, countering the erasure imposed by both the killer and systemic neglect. It highlights the importance of community engagement, advocacy, and social support in preventing vulnerability from being exploited. Investigators have also emphasized that Little's confessions, combined with sketches and historical data, serve as a vital tool for reconstructing the chronology of the victims' lives. Details about places visited, relationships, routines, and habits provide a fuller picture of who these women were, beyond the circumstances of their deaths. By preserving these details, law enforcement and historians create a multidimensional understanding that humanizes victims while contributing to the broader knowledge of criminal behavior, victimology, and social vulnerability. Each story reconstructed challenges societal tendencies to overlook marginalized individuals. By documenting and acknowledging these lives, society is confronted with both the tragedy of neglect and the resilience inherent in human experience. The victims' lives, while violently interrupted, continue to hold significance. Recognition of their identity, history, and humanity is a crucial counterbalance to the darkness of Little's crimes, ensuring that their presence is no longer invisible but etched into public consciousness. Ultimately, remembering the victims of Samuel Little transforms the narrative from one focused solely on the killer to one that honors those who suffered. Each life, when documented and acknowledged, provides context, meaning, and moral weight to the historical record. The stories restore dignity to individuals who were silenced, offer closure to families, and highlight the societal lessons inherent in their vulnerability. In commemorating their lives, the shadow cast by Samuel Little's crimes becomes not just a record of death and violence, but a testament to resilience, humanity, and the imperative to recognize and protect those most at risk. Chapter 12. Psychological Profile. Inside the mind of Samuel Little. To truly understand Samuel Little, one must delve into the intricate and chilling workings of his mind, a place where compulsion, obsession, and calculated strategy converge to produce one of the most prolific killing sprees in American history. His confessions, sketches, and detailed recollections provided investigators and psychologists with an unprecedented window into the cognitive and emotional mechanisms driving decades of violent behavior. Little's psychological profile reveals a complex interplay of psychopathy, antisocial behavior, and deeply ingrained patterns of memory, all of which contributed to the horrifying efficiency of his crimes. Central to Little's psychological makeup was a profound lack of empathy, a hallmark of psychopathy. He described his victims without apparent remorse, recalling details of their deaths with clinical detachment. This emotional absence allowed him to commit acts of extreme violence without the inhibition or guilt that restrains most individuals. Yet this lack of empathy coexisted with a heightened observational capacity. He was intensely aware of the vulnerabilities and behaviors of others, which he exploited with surgical precision. His mind was simultaneously detached from moral consequence and hyper-focused on social dynamics, creating the conditions for decades of predation that Little's compulsions were equally defining. He described a persistent and uncontrollable drive to kill, suggesting a psychological need that was both intense and ritualized. Each murder was not merely an act of opportunity. It was a manifestation of a long-standing compulsion, a pattern he described as irresistible. This compulsion was deeply intertwined with his memory. He cataloged victims, recalled physical attributes, and preserved details of encounters with extraordinary clarity. The combination of irresistible compulsion and precise recollection made him both dangerous and uniquely traceable once confessions began. The role of memory in Little's psychological profile cannot be overstated. Unlike many criminals whose recollection diminishes over time, Little's memory remained vivid and detailed, allowing him to produce accurate sketches and timelines decades after his crimes. Psychologists attribute this to obsessive cataloging. Every encounter, every act, was internalized with extreme precision. This memory served multiple purposes. It reinforced his compulsion, provided a sense of control, and ultimately became the foundation for the confessions that would decades later illuminate his unprecedented killing spree. Another defining aspect of Little's psychology was his strategic intelligence. Despite impulsive compulsions, he demonstrated foresight, adaptability, and situational awareness. He understood law enforcement limitations, the vulnerabilities of his victims, and the advantages of mobility. He consciously chose locations, times, and targets to minimize detection, showing a calculated aspect to his predatory behavior. This combination of impulsive compulsion and methodical strategy is rare among serial killers and contributes to understanding how he sustained a high volume of murders across multiple decades and states that Little's early life experiences offer additional insight into his psychological development. Childhood trauma, instability, and exposure to violence contributed to patterns of antisocial behavior, aggression, and detachment. Researchers note that while these experiences do not excuse his actions, they provide context for the formation of a mind predisposed to predatory behavior. Early criminality, substance abuse, and manipulation of peers were precursors to the adult manifestation of his violent impulses. The trajectory from childhood adversity to prolific serial predation demonstrates the complex interplay between environment, psychology, and choice. The intersection of compulsion, memory, and methodical planning defined Little's operational psychology. He could visualize potential victims, predict social interactions, and exploit vulnerabilities with alarming precision. Each murder reinforced his internal catalog of experience, sharpening both his compulsive drive and strategic acumen. This integration of cognitive and emotional processes created a feedback loop in which past actions informed future behavior, perpetuating a cycle of violence that spanned decades. Little's psychological profile also highlights a paradoxical awareness of his own pathology. He acknowledged his compulsions, understood their moral gravity, and recognized his manipulative strategies, yet he continued to act without restraint. This self-awareness, combined with detachment and planning, is a hallmark of advanced psychopathy. It reflects a mind capable of analyzing human behavior, anticipating responses, and executing violence with minimal ethical inhibition. This unique combination of traits distinguishes him from less sophisticated offenders and helps explain the unprecedented scale of his crimes. Finally, Little's psychological makeup underscores the importance of forensic and clinical analysis in understanding serial predation. By integrating confessions, sketches, victimology, and life history, psychologists and criminologists can reconstruct not only actions, but also motivations, cognitive patterns, and emotional drivers. Samuel Little's mind offers a rare case study in the interplay of compulsion, psychopathy, strategic intelligence, and memory, revealing the inner architecture of a killer whose actions reshaped the understanding of serial crime in America. As the psychological analysis of Samuel Little deepened, investigators and criminologists began to uncover the intricate architecture of his mind, a combination of obsessive compulsion, manipulative intelligence, and emotional detachment that enabled decades of prolific predation. Little's confessions, combined with sketches and victim recollections, provided an unparalleled opportunity to study the cognitive patterns and psychological drivers of a serial killer operating across multiple states and decades. Understanding his mind is critical not only for profiling him, but for comprehending the broader dynamics of serial predation and human vulnerability. Little exhibited a distinctive combination of psychopathy and strategic thinking. While most serial killers display either impulsive compulsion or methodical planning, Little blended both in a uniquely effective manner. His compulsions drove him to kill, yet he exercised careful planning to exploit systemic weaknesses, social invisibility, and environmental opportunities. He observed, manipulated, and predicted human behavior, often gaining the trust of vulnerable women to isolate them before executing his crimes. This duality of impulsive compulsion and calculated strategy contributed to his ability to evade detection for decades, making him both extraordinarily dangerous and uniquely instructive from a criminological perspective. Memory played a central role in Little's psychological profile. Unlike many offenders whose recollections fade over time, Little's memory remained vivid and highly detailed, enabling him to produce sketches and accounts that were decades later corroborated by missing persons reports. Psychologists attribute this to obsessive cataloging. He retained extensive internal records of interactions, appearances, and circumstances, effectively creating a mental database of victims. This exceptional memory not only facilitated later confessions, but also provided investigators with invaluable tools to reconstruct timelines, patterns, and connections across disparate cases. Each remembered detail reflected both the psychological fixation underlying his compulsion and the operational utility of memory in his crimes. That Little's understanding of human behavior was another key component of his predatory psychology. He could read social cues, assess vulnerability, and manipulate individuals into compliance. This insight allowed him to isolate victims with minimal resistance and reduced risk of discovery. Whether leveraging charm, intimidation, or deception, Little consistently applied psychological principles to gain control over his targets. These manipulative abilities reflect both cognitive sophistication and the emotional detachment characteristic of advanced psychopathy. His skill in reading and exploiting human behavior magnified the efficiency of his crimes and further complicated law enforcement's ability to anticipate or detect him. The compulsion to kill was intricately intertwined with control and obsession. Little described the act of killing as an irresistible urge, one that demanded satisfaction and reinforced his memory catalog of victims. Each murder was not only an act of violence, but a ritualized event, recorded with remarkable detail in his mind. This obsession with control, memory, and execution suggests a feedback loop in which compulsion, observation, and action reinforced one another, perpetuating a cycle of predation that spanned decades. The intensity of this internal drive is a central feature of his psychological profile, distinguishing him from less prolific offenders. Early life experiences provide context for the development of these patterns. Childhood trauma, instability, exposure to violence, and early criminal behavior shaped the psychological landscape that later manifested in serial predation. While not deterministic, these experiences contributed to the formation of antisocial behavior, lack of empathy, and an ability to manipulate others without remorse. Understanding these formative influences allows psychologists to contextualize the development of a mind capable of sustaining long-term, high-volume murder while simultaneously exhibiting intelligence, strategic thinking, and obsessive memory. That Little's interactions with investigators also reveal a self-awareness rare among serial killers. He openly described his compulsions, methods, and motivations, acknowledging both the horror of his actions and the mechanisms that allowed him to operate undetected. This insight, while chilling, provides critical information for criminal profiling, illustrating a cognitive understanding of crime, social dynamics, and systemic vulnerability. By cooperating, Little effectively transformed confessions into data, offering a blueprint for understanding the interplay between psychological drive, methodical planning, and environmental exploitation. Finally, Little's psychological profile underscores the broader implications for criminology, law enforcement, and societal awareness. His mind represents a convergence of compulsion, strategic intelligence, and social perception, demonstrating how high-functioning psychopathy can manifest in sustained, multi-decade predation. Studying his behavior illuminates not only the mechanics of his crimes, but also the vulnerabilities within social systems, law enforcement, and communities that can be exploited by sophisticated offenders. By analyzing the patterns, motivations, and cognitive processes of Samuel Little, investigators gain tools for prevention, detection, and intervention in future cases involving highly intelligent and compulsive predators. Ultimately, the study of Samuel Little's psychological profile bridges the gap between human behavior and criminal action. It reveals a mind simultaneously driven by uncontrollable urge, capable of meticulous planning, and profoundly detached from moral consequence. It underscores the chilling reality that extreme compulsion, intelligence, and social awareness can coexist within a single individual, producing a pattern of predation that is both methodical and devastatingly effective. By examining his mind, society gains not only insight into the psychology of a serial killer, but also a framework for understanding the conditions that allow such predation to persist and for developing strategies to prevent it in the future. Chapter 13: Law Enforcement and Investigation. The Long Road to Justice. The story of Samuel Little is not only a tale of horrific crimes, but also a testament to the persistence, innovation, and challenges of law enforcement over decades. Investigators faced an unprecedented task: uncovering the truth behind the most prolific serial killer in American history, a man whose crimes spanned multiple states, decades, and countless jurisdictions. Understanding how law enforcement approached, documented, and eventually solved these cases provides a crucial lens into both the evolution of investigative methods and the systemic challenges that allowed such predation to continue largely undetected for decades. From the outset, Little was a difficult subject for law enforcement. His crimes were widely dispersed geographically, occurring in cities ranging from Los Angeles to New York, Louisville to Chicago. These jurisdictions, often unaware of each other's investigations due to the pre-digital era's limited interdepartmental communication, were ill-equipped to identify patterns. Each disappearance or unsolved homicide was often treated in isolation, leaving detectives unable to link incidents across state lines. This fragmented investigative environment allowed Little to exploit gaps in the system, committing murders with minimal immediate risk of detection or connection. When law enforcement began to focus on Little, decades of cold cases suddenly required careful, meticulous cross-referencing. Detectives examined old case files, missing persons reports, and archived crime scene evidence, attempting to piece together patterns that had remained hidden for years. The enormity of this task cannot be overstated. Each case needed verification, comparison with Little's confessions, and corroboration with physical evidence where possible. Investigators relied heavily on timelines, sketches, and witness statements, often revisiting cases that had long been closed or classified as unsolved. The process demanded patience, dedication, and an extraordinary level of attention to detail, highlighting the complexity of addressing crimes that had unfolded over decades. That Little's confessions, beginning after his arrest in 2012 for unrelated crimes, revolutionized the investigative process. Unlike many serial killers who deny responsibility or provide minimal cooperation, Little confessed to 93 murders and demonstrated remarkable specificity. He provided names, locations, dates, and even details about his victims' appearances, habits, and personal circumstances. Law enforcement immediately recognized the unprecedented value of these confessions, using them as a framework to reopen cold cases, match sketches to missing persons, and begin a nationwide verification process. Collaboration across agencies became a defining feature of the investigation. Local, state, and federal authorities pooled resources, knowledge, and records to verify Little's claims. Departments that had previously operated in isolation now coordinated, comparing evidence and consolidating data in ways previously impossible. The FBI, along with state law enforcement, facilitated cross-jurisdictional communication, providing expertise in forensic review, psychological profiling, and victim identification. This unprecedented level of cooperation allowed decades-old cold cases to be reopened and examined with fresh eyes, bringing clarity to events that had long eluded resolution. That a critical tool in these investigations was Little's sketches, which proved invaluable in identifying victims. Many of his victims had no official photographs, and some had never been reported missing. The sketches, drawn from memory, offered law enforcement a visual reference to corroborate missing persons reports, match forensic evidence, and elicit recognition from families and communities. This integration of artistic recollection into investigative methodology represented a novel and highly effective approach, bridging memory and fact in the service of justice. Verification of Little's confessions was rigorous and multifaceted. Investigators cross-referenced dates, locations, and physical characteristics with available case files, using forensic evidence where possible. In many instances, the victims' identities were confirmed through family interviews, historical documentation, or DNA evidence. This painstaking process not only validated Little's claims, but also allowed law enforcement to construct a detailed timeline of his predation, uncovering patterns that had previously gone unnoticed. Each confirmed case represented both a resolution of a decades-old mystery and a testament to the persistence and skill of investigators. The investigative process also highlighted systemic challenges. Many of Little's victims were women who had been socially marginalized, facing poverty, addiction, or transient lifestyles. These vulnerabilities contributed to the lack of initial investigative attention, delays in reporting, and gaps in documentation. Law enforcement had to navigate decades of incomplete records, fragmented files, and bureaucratic limitations to reconstruct events accurately. In doing so, they not only sought justice for the victims, but also confronted the broader societal factors that had enabled Little to operate with impunity for so long. Through collaboration, perseverance, and innovative use of confessions and sketches, law enforcement was able to illuminate the scope of Samuel Little's crimes. The investigation became a landmark case in the study of serial predation, demonstrating the potential for cold cases to be solved through detailed analysis, cross-jurisdictional cooperation, and the integration of unconventional evidence sources. Each identified victim, each verified confession, represents not only justice served, but also the triumph of investigative diligence over decades of systemic challenges and human loss. As the investigation into Samuel Little intensified, law enforcement faced the monumental task of reconciling decades of fragmented data, conflicting records, and incomplete case files. Each new confession required meticulous verification, often demanding months of cross-referencing missing persons reports, forensic evidence, and community records. Detectives and investigators approached this challenge with painstaking care, recognizing that accuracy was paramount not only for justice, but also for the integrity of historical record. Every confirmed victim represented a story reclaimed from obscurity and a testament to the diligence of investigative teams. One of the most significant breakthroughs in this process was the integration of technology with traditional investigative methods. Modern databases allowed for cross-state comparisons of missing persons reports, crime scene evidence, and witness statements that were previously siloed within local jurisdictions. Digital mapping tools enabled investigators to plot Little's movements, revealing geographic clusters and patterns of predation that spanned decades. These technological advancements, combined with the human insight provided by confessions and sketches, created an unprecedented framework for understanding the scale and reach of his crimes. That Little's willingness to cooperate, providing detailed recollections and sketches, was both unusual and transformative. Unlike many serial killers who evade responsibility or manipulate the truth, Little offered precise, often verifiable information. He described each victim with remarkable specificity: clothing, physical features, habits, and circumstances surrounding the murder. Investigators could cross-check these details with historical records, photographs, and family testimonies, providing confirmation that lent credibility to his claims. In essence, Little became both the key and the roadmap to solving a decades-long puzzle of unsolved homicides. Family involvement was crucial in this phase of the investigation. Relatives of missing persons were interviewed to verify details, recall personal memories, and provide any photographs or documents that might assist identification. These interactions were emotionally charged. For many families, decades of uncertainty were suddenly replaced with painful but necessary truths. Law enforcement had to navigate this delicate terrain with sensitivity and professionalism, ensuring that the pursuit of justice did not exacerbate grief while simultaneously validating decades-long fears. Each confirmation became a poignant intersection of closure and sorrow, a bittersweet resolution to years of ambiguity. The challenge of verifying Little's confessions highlighted the limitations and strengths of law enforcement systems. On one hand, gaps in historical records, misfiled reports, and social biases complicated the process. Many victims, often marginalized, were not reported missing promptly or at all, leaving detectives without initial leads. On the other hand, the collaborative efforts across jurisdictions, the integration of digital tools, and the rigorous attention to detail enabled investigators to overcome these obstacles. The success of the investigation demonstrates the importance of persistence, creativity, and interagency cooperation in addressing long-standing crimes. Forensic science played an integral role in corroborating confessions. DNA evidence, where available, allowed for positive identification, while crime scene analysis helped confirm details described by Little. In cases where physical evidence had degraded or been lost, corroboration relied heavily on historical records, witness statements, and Little's sketches. This multifaceted approach exemplified modern investigative techniques, blending traditional detective work with scientific validation, and underscored the adaptability required to tackle complex serial crimes spanning decades. Another striking aspect of the investigation was the psychological interplay between Little and law enforcement. While providing detailed confessions, he also revealed insight into his own motivations and methods, offering a rare glimpse into the cognitive processes of a prolific serial killer. Investigators and psychologists analyzed his recollections not only for factual accuracy, but also for behavioral patterns, decision-making processes, and strategic methods of predation. This dual perspective, combining factual verification with psychological analysis, allowed law enforcement to reconstruct a comprehensive understanding of Little's crimes, bridging the gap between human behavior and criminal action. The nationwide scope of the investigation demanded unprecedented coordination. Federal agencies like the FBI facilitated communication, data sharing, and standardized protocols for verification. State and local police departments, sometimes decades removed from the initial cases, worked in tandem to cross-reference files, interview witnesses, and validate confessions. This collaboration represents one of the most extensive and successful cross-jurisdictional investigative efforts in modern American criminal history. The lessons learned extend beyond Little's crimes, offering a blueprint for handling other complex, long-running serial investigations in the future. Through decades of investigative diligence, the process of uncovering Little's crimes demonstrates the intersection of patience, innovation, and human tenacity. Every confirmed confession, every verified sketch, and every identified victim represents not only justice, but also the triumph of methodical investigation over systemic challenges. The work of law enforcement illuminated a dark chapter in American criminal history, restored dignity to forgotten victims, and provided critical insight into both the methodology of a prolific killer and the vulnerabilities of the social and legal systems he exploited. Ultimately, the long road to justice in the case of Samuel Little exemplifies the resilience, adaptability, and determination of law enforcement. It underscores the necessity of interagency collaboration, the integration of psychological and forensic insights, and the ethical responsibility to restore identity to those lost to violence. Through decades of work, investigators transformed confessions into validated cases, memories into evidence, and tragedy into a comprehensive historical record, forever altering the understanding of serial predation in America. Chapter 14: Confessions and Revelations. The unveiling of the full scale. The confessions of Samuel Little represent one of the most remarkable aspects of his criminal narrative. Unlike many serial killers who evade responsibility, obscure details, or selectively reveal crimes, Little provided law enforcement with a nearly exhaustive account of his actions, revealing the staggering scale of his predation. His willingness to confess, combined with extraordinary memory and descriptive detail, transformed decades of cold cases into a comprehensive understanding of America's most prolific serial killer. These confessions, however, were not merely admissions of guilt. They became investigative tools, historical records, and psychological windows into a mind capable of sustaining decades of systematic violence. When Little began confessing, law enforcement was initially cautious. Many claims were extraordinary in both number and geographic breadth, spanning nearly every region of the United States. Investigators needed to verify these accounts meticulously. Each confession demanded cross-referencing with missing persons reports, witness statements, and historical documentation, requiring a level of patience, rigor, and analytical precision rarely needed in criminal investigations. The extraordinary volume of his confessions, 93 murders, posed logistical challenges, yet also provided an unprecedented opportunity to map decades of criminal behavior with remarkable clarity. That Little's confessions were notable for their specificity. He provided names, approximate ages, locations, clothing descriptions, and circumstances surrounding the murders. He could recall where victims lived, how he met them, and even particular details about their daily routines. This level of detail, often decades after the murders occurred, was instrumental in verifying identities and connecting cold cases that had long been considered unsolvable. His extraordinary memory transformed confessions into a practical investigative instrument, bridging decades of investigative gaps and providing closure to families long left in uncertainty. One of the most compelling aspects of the confessions was their contribution to victim identification. Many of Little's victims had never been reported missing, lacked photographs, or were socially marginalized. His recollections, coupled with forensic analysis and sketch artistry, allowed investigators to restore identities and reconstruct life histories. Each confirmed confession transformed abstract statistics into real lives, providing families and communities with information that had long been absent. This process elevated the confessions beyond criminal admissions, making them acts of historical and human significance. The confessions also revealed patterns that had previously been undetectable. By analyzing the chronology, locations, and methods described in his admissions, investigators were able to map the geographic spread of his predation, identify temporal clusters, and establish the continuity of his modus operandi. This retrospective analysis illuminated how Little exploited systemic gaps, targeted vulnerable populations, and refined his methods over decades. It offered criminologists an unparalleled opportunity to study the evolution of a serial killer's behavior across multiple decades and jurisdictions, providing insights rarely accessible in criminal profiling. That Little's confessions were both procedural and psychological in nature. On the procedural level, they facilitated law enforcement's ability to corroborate evidence and verify cold cases. On the psychological level, they offered insight into his cognitive processes, compulsions, and understanding of human behavior. Through his admissions, investigators observed the interplay of compulsion, memory, and strategic manipulation, revealing a mind capable of methodical planning while simultaneously driven by uncontrollable urges. The confessions therefore serve as both factual records and analytic windows, enabling a holistic understanding of his criminal psychology. The act of confessing also had a deeply human dimension. Little's admissions, while devoid of overt remorse, reflected a desire to be understood and recognized for the scope of his actions. He cataloged his victims meticulously, often recounting personal details and idiosyncrasies that humanized them in his memory. These confessions transformed decades of anonymous tragedy into a structured narrative, allowing society to comprehend the true scale of his crimes and the extent of systemic oversight that had allowed them to persist. Each revelation became a bridge between memory and reality, fiction and fact, darkness and understanding. Law enforcement's reception of the confessions required careful methodological rigor. Investigators had to separate accurate recollections from potential distortions, cross-reference details with historical records, and validate identities where possible. This iterative process demanded collaboration across multiple agencies, reliance on forensic techniques, and the application of criminological theory. In doing so, the confessions evolved from verbal admissions into verified, documented, and actionable case files, establishing a precedent for large-scale serial crime investigation and identification. Furthermore, the confessions highlighted the importance of integrating non-traditional methods into investigative practice. Sketch artistry, interviews, and detailed recollections provided a multidimensional approach to victim identification and timeline reconstruction. By combining these elements with forensic evidence and digital records, law enforcement could not only confirm the facts of each murder, but also reconstruct the broader narrative of Little's predation. These methods exemplify how confessions, when corroborated and contextualized, become central to both justice and historical understanding. Ultimately, the confessions of Samuel Little represent the unveiling of the full scale of one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. Each admission, each descriptive account, and each corroborated detail contributed to a comprehensive understanding of the extent, methodology, and human impact of his crimes. The confessions serve as a bridge between decades of uncertainty and the factual reconstruction of lost lives, transforming an incomprehensible scale of violence into documented reality and offering society both insight and closure. As Samuel Little continued to provide confessions, the enormity of his crimes became increasingly undeniable. Each narrative he offered was like a piece of a complex puzzle spanning decades, revealing a chilling map of violence across the United States. These confessions not only identified individual victims, but also demonstrated the systemic gaps and societal oversights that allowed such predation to persist for so long. They were a revelation of both criminal mastery and societal failure, demanding meticulous attention from law enforcement and historians alike. That Little's confessions illuminated patterns of movement and behavior that law enforcement had previously struggled to decipher. He traversed cities and states with ease, exploiting social invisibility and fragmented jurisdictional oversight. His predation was not random. He carefully selected environments and victims that allowed him maximum control with minimal risk. From motel rooms and transient neighborhoods to public spaces where women were alone, he navigated society with an acute awareness of opportunity and vulnerability. By mapping his confessions against historical data, investigators could trace this mobility and understand the mechanisms that allowed him to operate undetected for decades. One of the most remarkable aspects of these confessions was Little's precision in recalling physical characteristics and personal details. He remembered tattoos, clothing, hairstyles, and even subtle personality traits of his victims, creating a catalog of human lives with extraordinary specificity. For law enforcement, these details were invaluable. They allowed detectives to match confessions to cold cases, verify identities, and even elicit recognition from family members who had long been searching for answers. Each detail provided a thread connecting the past to the present, transforming ambiguity into clarity and speculation into verified fact. The confessions also revealed the psychological dynamics of Little's predation. He described not only the acts of killing, but also the interactions leading up to them, the manipulation, coercion, and observation of his victims. He recounted how he gained trust, isolated women, and enacted control with meticulous attention to detail. These admissions offer a window into the operational psychology of a serial killer, showing how intelligence, compulsion, and strategic planning can coexist within a single mind. They illustrate a terrifying blend of human calculation and uncontrollable urge, which, when combined, produce the scale of violence Little committed. law enforcement agencies faced the daunting task of verifying each confession. In many cases, physical evidence had long been lost or degraded, requiring investigators to rely on cross-referencing historical records, interviews, and photographs. This painstaking process demanded extraordinary attention to detail and collaboration across multiple jurisdictions. Departments had to reconcile decades-old discrepancies in reporting, correct misfiled case documents, and coordinate with families for verification. The task was not only procedural but emotional, as each confirmation reopened wounds and brought renewed attention to long-lost loved ones. Beyond individual case verification, the confessions reshaped understanding of serial crime in America. They illustrated the sheer scale possible when a predator operates across state lines with impunity, exploiting social invisibility and systemic fragmentation. By revealing his own methods, Little provided a rare empirical data set for criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals. The confessions demonstrated how mobility, victim selection, and memory can combine to sustain a long-term killing spree, offering critical insights into behavioral patterns, risk factors, and preventative strategies. Family members of victims, upon hearing the confessions, experienced a complex mix of grief, relief, and closure. Decades of uncertainty were suddenly replaced with factual acknowledgement. For many, the process validated suspicions, confirmed tragic realities, and allowed for the beginning of a healing process. Law enforcement acted as an intermediary, translating confessions into verified information that restored identity to the victims. Each revelation was both a confirmation of loss and a testament to the human need for truth and recognition, emphasizing that justice is not merely punitive but also restorative. In addition, Little's confessions revealed the importance of non-traditional investigative tools in solving cold cases. His sketches, detailed recollections, and personal narratives provided evidence where forensic material was unavailable. By combining these insights with traditional investigative methods and technological advancements, law enforcement created a multidimensional approach to victim identification and case resolution. This innovative integration of memory, art, and science has set new standards for cold case investigations, illustrating the potential of comprehensive, multidisciplinary strategies. Ultimately, the confessions of Samuel Little represent the unveiling of the full scale of his crimes, transforming decades of fragmented information into a cohesive and horrifying narrative. They illuminate not only the scope of violence, but also the resilience of investigative work, the persistence of memory, and the societal importance of recognizing marginalized lives. Through his admissions, decades of uncertainty were resolved, victims were restored to historical record, and the dark narrative of America's most prolific serial killer became comprehensively understood. The confessions, both factual and psychological, stand as a testament to the interplay of criminal compulsion, human oversight, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Chapter 15: Legacy and Lessons. Reflecting on Samuel Little's crimes, the story of Samuel Little does not end with his confessions, convictions, or imprisonment. It extends into the broader implications his crimes have had on law enforcement, criminology, social awareness, and the understanding of serial predation in America. The legacy of Little's unprecedented killing spree is multifaceted. It encompasses the lives of the victims he claimed, the families forever altered, the investigative breakthroughs achieved, and the critical lessons learned about societal vulnerability, justice, and human behavior. Chapter 15 seeks to examine these legacies and the enduring insights gleaned from one of the darkest chapters in modern criminal history, Samuel Little's crimes revealed the profound consequences of social invisibility. Many of his victims were women marginalized by poverty, addiction, or transient lifestyles, whose absences were often overlooked by authorities, families, or communities. This systemic neglect created an environment in which a prolific predator could operate for decades with minimal risk of detection. The societal implication is stark. When certain populations are rendered invisible, they become highly susceptible to exploitation and violence. Understanding this dynamic remains a vital lesson for law enforcement, social services, and communities striving to protect vulnerable populations. Law enforcement's handling of Little's confessions illustrates both the evolution of investigative methodology and the importance of cross-jurisdictional collaboration. Prior to the digital age, the fragmented nature of records, databases, and interagency communication allowed serial predators like Little to evade detection. His confessions necessitated unprecedented coordination between local, state, and federal agencies, combining historical documentation, forensic science, interviews, and technological tools to verify decades of claims. The process highlighted the power of collaboration, persistence, and innovation in solving complex crimes, providing a template for future investigations into serial predation and cold cases. That Little's confessions also reinforced the critical role of human memory and cognitive insight in criminal investigations. His extraordinary recollection, combined with meticulous documentation in sketches and narratives, offered investigators a detailed roadmap to unravel decades of unsolved murders. These confessions demonstrated that, in certain cases, the mental records of offenders can serve as an invaluable investigative tool when corroborated with physical evidence and historical documentation. They transformed law enforcement understanding of how to leverage unconventional evidence in cold case investigations, emphasizing that memory, observation, and psychological insight can be as powerful as physical proof in achieving justice. The psychological analysis of Little's behavior has left a profound mark on criminology and forensic psychology. His unique combination of compulsive drive, strategic intelligence, social manipulation, and obsessive memory challenges prior conceptions of serial offenders. By studying his actions, psychologists and criminologists have gained insights into the interplay between environment, compulsion, and methodical planning in serial predation. Little's case underscores the necessity of integrating behavioral profiling with investigative tactics, providing a framework for understanding how extreme psychopathy can manifest in sustained, multi-decade criminal behavior. The victim's restoration to historical record represents another critical aspect of Little's legacy. Each identification, reconstruction, and acknowledgement of life serves as a counterbalance to the erasure caused by marginalization and violence. These efforts highlight the moral and social imperative of recognizing and documenting every human life, emphasizing that justice extends beyond punishment to remembrance, restoration, and acknowledgement. In this sense, Little's legacy is not solely the horror of his crimes, but also the broader societal awakening to the importance of visibility, dignity, and human value for all individuals. Families of victims have experienced a complex interplay of closure, grief, and understanding as a result of confessions and investigations. While decades of uncertainty were finally addressed, the emotional weight of confirmation was profound. Law enforcement's role in facilitating this process demonstrates the human dimension of investigative work. It is not only about solving crimes, but also about providing resolution, recognition, and validation for those left behind. Little's crimes, therefore, extended the impact of violence far beyond the immediate victims, affecting communities, families, and society at large. reinforcing the ripple effect of predation over time. The investigation of Samuel Little has also influenced criminal justice policies, particularly in the areas of cold case management and interagency cooperation. By illustrating the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed decades of predation, his case has inspired the development of centralized databases, improved communication between jurisdictions, and enhanced protocols for tracking missing persons and unsolved murders. The lessons learned underscore that systemic improvement is a crucial component of preventing similar patterns of serial predation in the future, highlighting the enduring impact of one individual's crimes on law enforcement practices and societal awareness. Moreover, the confessions and subsequent verification of Little's crimes underscore the potential for justice to emerge even after decades of darkness. They exemplify the persistence required in investigative work and the possibility of resolving cases once deemed impossible. The process reinforces the importance of diligence, innovation, and interdisciplinary collaboration, emphasizing that no case is beyond reach if investigators combine modern tools, historical knowledge, and human insight. Samuel Little's story, while horrifying, ultimately demonstrates the capacity of law enforcement and society to reclaim lost narratives and restore justice. Even decades after the fact, as society reflects on Little's crimes. The lessons extend beyond law enforcement and criminology into broader social consciousness. His predation illustrates the consequences of neglect, the vulnerabilities created by marginalization, and the necessity of empathy and social accountability. It challenges communities to recognize and protect those at risk, to value lives regardless of social standing, and to create systems that ensure visibility, protection, and dignity for all. In this sense, the legacy of Samuel Little is not only historical but also profoundly ethical, compelling society to confront its own shortcomings and safeguarding the most vulnerable. Ultimately, the legacy of Samuel Little is layered. It is the horror of his crimes, the resilience of investigators, the restoration of victims' identities, the insights into criminal psychology, and the societal imperative to prevent marginalization from enabling predation. His story represents both a dark chapter in American history and a catalyst for understanding, reflection, and systemic improvement. It is a narrative that forces society to confront the interplay of human vulnerability, predation, and justice, leaving enduring lessons for the present and future. As the final pieces of Samuel Little's confessions were verified and documented, the full scope of his crimes became undeniable, leaving society with profound questions about human behavior, systemic oversight, and the meaning of justice. While his convictions brought legal closure, the broader implications of his actions extended far beyond the courtroom. They challenged law enforcement, social institutions, and the public to reconsider how society protects its most vulnerable members and responds to the unseen threats that lurk within the shadows of daily life. The scale of Little's crimes, spanning 93 confirmed murders, underscores a chilling reality. When societal structures fail to monitor, support, and protect marginalized populations, predators can exploit these vulnerabilities with devastating efficiency. Many of Little's victims were women who lived on the fringes of society, facing poverty, addiction, or transient lifestyles. Their social invisibility created an environment in which crimes could occur unnoticed, underreported, or deprioritized. This recognition has prompted law enforcement agencies to reevaluate procedures for missing persons cases, cold case prioritization, and victim outreach, emphasizing the necessity of vigilance and equity in protective measures. One of the most significant aspects of Little's legacy is the empowerment of investigative methodology. His confessions, sketches, and detailed recollections became an extraordinary resource, allowing investigators to reconstruct decades of predation that had remained largely hidden. These revelations demonstrated the power of interdisciplinary approaches, combining forensic science, psychological profiling, historical research, and cross-jurisdictional collaboration. They reinforced the principle that even the most complex, long-running criminal cases can be solved with patience, innovation, and strategic coordination, setting new standards for addressing cold cases nationwide. The psychological insights gained from Little's case have reshaped criminological understanding of serial predation. His unique combination of compulsive drive, strategic intelligence, and social manipulation challenged conventional assumptions about offender behavior. By analyzing his confessions, investigators and psychologists gained unprecedented access to the mind of a prolific serial killer, observing how obsession, memory, and calculated methodology intertwine. Little's case now serves as a benchmark for understanding complex serial predation, providing both predictive insight for future investigations and theoretical knowledge for behavioral science. Another enduring lesson lies in the recognition and restoration of victims' identities. Little's crimes, though horrific, prompted a renewed societal commitment to acknowledging the lives of those marginalized or forgotten. Each confirmed confession, verified sketch, and reconstructed timeline restored dignity and memory to a victim long obscured by systemic neglect. In this sense, the investigation became not only a pursuit of justice, but also an act of societal remembrance, transforming tragedy into acknowledgement and reinforcing the moral imperative to honor every human life, regardless of social status. The ripple effects of Little's crimes on families and communities have been profound. Decades of uncertainty and grief were suddenly transformed into a complex blend of closure and sorrow. Families were finally able to confront reality, reclaim memories, and understand the circumstances surrounding their lost loved ones. Law enforcement acted as a mediator in this emotionally charged process, translating confessions into validated facts and providing context that allowed families to navigate the intertwined emotions of loss, justice, and historical understanding. This aspect of the case underscores that justice encompasses more than legal adjudication. It includes emotional resolution and the restoration of narrative to those affected. Little's legacy also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of societal oversight, marginalization, and underreporting. His crimes reveal the consequences when communities fail to monitor, support, or acknowledge vulnerable populations. The investigation highlighted the importance of timely reporting, effective communication among law enforcement agencies, and social structures that prioritize the protection of at-risk individuals. By examining these failures, policymakers, social workers, and law enforcement are better equipped to prevent similar patterns of predation in the future, using the lessons of Little's case as both warning and guide. Furthermore, the confessions exemplify the enduring power of human memory and personal accountability in criminal investigations. Little's extraordinary recollections, combined with detailed narrative and visual sketches, became a critical tool for reconstructing crimes spanning decades. They demonstrate that even in the absence of physical evidence, the cognitive and descriptive capabilities of offenders can provide actionable insight. This has reshaped approaches to cold case investigation, encouraging a greater reliance on verbal, cognitive, and historical evidence in tandem with scientific analysis. Ultimately, the story of Samuel Little is a sobering exploration of the depths of human depravity and the resilience of investigative perseverance. His crimes highlight systemic weaknesses, social vulnerabilities, and the horrifying efficiency of a mind driven by compulsion and calculation. Yet, his confessions also illuminate the capacity for justice, closure, and societal learning. Law enforcement, psychologists, criminologists, families, and communities all emerge from this dark chapter with deeper understanding, innovative methodologies, and a renewed commitment to protecting the vulnerable. The legacy of Samuel Little is therefore both cautionary and instructive. It is a reminder of the horrors that can flourish in the shadows of oversight, but also a testament to the persistence, innovation, and humanity that can reclaim lost lives, restore historical record, and transform tragedy into knowledge. His crimes will forever serve as a case study in the extremes of human behavior, the evolution of serial predation, and the essential societal responsibility to protect, acknowledge, and honor those most at risk. Through understanding his actions, society gains both insight and vigilance, ensuring that the lessons of Samuel Little endure well beyond the historical record of his crimes.